Okay. Tako da lepo pozdravljeni v Muzeju za arhitekturo in oblikovanje na ta deževen petkov popoldan, ampak popoldan, ki res veliko obeta. Gre za uvodni simpozij poletne šole, ki letos poteka že v 11. ediciji programa AA Visiting School Nanotourism londonske Architectural Association. Tako da dovolite mi, da zaradi mednarodne narave današnjega simpozija nadaljujem v angleščini. A warm welcome to Museum of Architecture and Design. Today we are opening the 11th edition of AA Visiting School Nanotourism, which operates within London Architectural Association. I'm very pleased that we are continuing this partnership with AA and MAO for the second time. A special welcome goes to the speakers of today's symposium and to the participants of this year's school, who, under the guidance of architects Aljoša Dekleva and Vid Žnidaršič, will build upon the insights and knowledge gained from the last year's symposium, an architectural workshop dedicated to Ljubljana and its most celebrated architect, Jože Plečnik. Plečnik was and remains a truly unique architect on a global scale. His works represent some of the most original and distinctive examples of 20th century architecture, impossible to situate it within any single architectural movement. I believe that Plečnik's architecture unfolds in the undeterminate space, in a space in between. It's a body of work that brings into consciousness the relationship between history and modernity, eternity and temporality, community and solitude, warmth and alienation, social democracy and classicism. And it explores in many ways what means to be alive also today, including all the frictions of our plural world. So I believe that it's precisely this in-between position, which resists clear definition and framing, that continues to mark Plečnik's work relevant and topical time and again. And this symposium and the school that follows represents yet another attempt to analyze the phenomenon of Plečnik and his work from the perspective of this current moment. I think we all know that history of architecture is shaped by more than one single canon, even if usually this single canon prevails. So Plečnik, for example, has been rediscovered in waves by exceptional scholars over the course of more than 120 years. And most recently, we have witnessed yet another wave, this time shaped by a new generation of architects who continue to question and expand the canon. Some of these perspectives were presented at last year's symposium by Slovenian researchers. And today, however, we will hear voices from beyond our immediate context. And the aim of this symposium is precisely to offer such an external view. So I wish you a very inspiring afternoon and enriching days that follows. And now I give the word to Aljoša Dekleva.
Thank you, Maya, for the introduction, for hosting us, and for the long-lasting collaboration. So a warm welcome to everyone, also from our side, the AA Nanotourism Visiting School, and thank you for coming in this rainy day that might be ideal for symposiums like this. And this is our 11th edition, and our program is being in Ljubljana for the second time. There is a bit of echo, right? No. Let's see if we can fix that. It's going to be easier for everybody to follow. So, yes, the symposium is a starting point for an international group of students that are here with us today, who will gain insights into the relevance of Plečnik's work and establish a framework for the workshop. At the same time, we are very grateful for this collaboration with the museum, which enables us to also open this symposium for the professional and academic public. So the underlying theme of the visiting school is nanotourism, and that's a constructed term that describes a creative critique of tourism as we know it today. And why nanotourism in Ljubljana? In 2021, the UNESCO World Heritage Convention listed the Ljubljana works of the architect Jože Plecnik as an example of human-centered design. And this Plečnik set of works in Ljubljana elevates the city public space to a higher level of recognizability and identity. Furthermore, the set of works is protected as a whole rather than isolated architectural fragments. Ljubljana might as well be the only city in the world whose urban identity has been so thoroughly defined by one single architect. In fact, both general and professional public often use the term Plečnik's Ljubljana when we want to refer to the urban phenomenon you can experience just by walking through the city center. So how are we trying to achieve that? With the symposiums, a series of symposiums, we bring together diverse perspectives delivered by different experts who relate to Plečnik with their respective fields of work, and we are looking for new angles, and we are deepening our understanding of Plečnik through their experience. Last year's symposium set out to open a fresh perspective, inviting a new generation of Slovenian experts from both the practice and the theory to critically engage with Plečnik's legacy. Building on the foundational work of the previous generation of Plečnik's experts, the discussion sought to go beyond established narratives. This year's symposium shifts the focus outward with the views from the outside, inviting perspectives on Plečnik from beyond Slovenia's borders. By inviting architects, researchers, and that are active abroad, the symposium aims to uncover maybe overlooked dimensions of Plečnik's legacy, maybe from other cities, and explores its wider resonance across geographies, disciplines, and generations. So, on the other hand, at the level of the 2-week workshop, we experiment at the scale 1-to-1 with conceptual interventions that lie somewhere between architecture and art. Again, both levels, the symposium and the workshop, share the same goal, which is to gain knowledge and experience that can help us imagine the future of Plečnik's Ljubljana. Allow me now to present some last year's 5 case studies that and what follows is going to be an intense visual narrative showing the process of each case study, spanning research, design, and the making of conceptual urban interventions. So initially, we wrote 4 micro-briefs for students groups to select their preferred starting point. So let's start with bridges. This topic challenged the way we think about bridges. Plečnik showed in Ljubljana how bridges are never just crossings. They are hybrid structures that also serve as plazas, gateways, and even social places with their own identity and purpose. So the project postpones a bridge is a bench, is a table, is a chair. So the student group explored on their own the bridges of Plečnik, and they gave their own understanding, little narratives and titles of each of those bridges, only to identify then a very specific location in Gradaščica, which is a small river connecting to Ljubljana, where Plečnik has already designed a specific place, which is not really a bridge. It's just kind of 2 staircases facing each other on each side of the little riverbank. And the first prototypes were experimenting how an intervention into the water changes the perspective of the user in relation to the water and how the water changes. So further on, experimenting in prototyping, this is an example of a bridge that tries not to disconnect with the water, but to provide a very close experience. Or maybe it's a little bit lifted, it becomes a little bench, or even a table. So all of those prototypes, they needed like a feedback, real users' feedback. So they organized a social event where they got a lot of experience and feedback of the users in understanding what to work on. So reflecting of learnings of this prototype performing one-to-one in space, they started to understand and brainstorm how to employ their designs in order to address all those issues that have came up during the event. So they did a little internal competition of 100 sketches, each sketch conceptualizing one specific approach or one specific element that would address different approaches. So eventually they ended up with a selection of a chair, which is already showing a little bit more than just a chair. So they engineered the design until they were happy with what they were holding in their hands with producing it, and they kind of tripled these chairs, which are somehow the same, but symbolically also different. Of course, they are on the first glance chairs, but they already hint that they can become something else, like a bridge that has exact span for the Gradaščica River. So the bridge that they proposed is a secret bridge, known and used only by inhabitants, by neighbors. The project brings back the individual intimate experience of walking near and over the water, but it also engages users' creativity and thoughts by constantly questions its daily use and performance. So the bridge is actually a bridge for the local community, for their individual experience or maybe collective ones, including occasional public events. The next topic, it was about National University Library. That is one of the most prominent buildings in Ljubljana, serving as a repository of knowledge that is meant to be accessible to everyone. Yet its austere presence is strictly regulated access create a sense of exclusivity, making it feel more like a fortress than just a public space. So the project Nukeland, or Nukeland, deals with the ergonomics of the National University Library. So even from the view from the castle, this already presents as a fortress. And talking to people who were either using that building or the people who were managing with that building, they understood there is a disconnection with ergonomics comforts. And even disconnection between protecting the books as the knowledge and inviting students for studying, which the head of events and public relations pointed out, this duality that it is a national library, but also the university library. So figuring out that dealing within the inside is pretty much already saturated and impossible, they started to explore the ergonomics of the building outside, starting with its haptical facade, exploring situations like this, where people could start do stretching within this Plečnik's three-dimensional stone facade. But they extended their research even further on with this little Plečnik's arrangements towards Vegova Street, where the spatial situation offers slightly different levels and quite a lot of opportunities how to use the space. So they looked around to different Plečnik's artifacts, including the kiosk that kind of cut in half, and the bench that they hacked, and eventually it turned into a seesaw as an additional moment around Plečnik's library that offers a different ergonomic experience. The facade somehow started to be a remnants of the function of the library, and the stone facades become shelving for books. So the project culminated in a public event held in collaboration with the association Library Under the Treetops, transforming the outside of Nuuk into an open-air reading room, illustrating the potential of Nuuk to become more than just a fortress. So it showed how curated public interaction can reclaim both the building facade and its immediate surrounding. Through subtle body-oriented interventions, they invited people to inhabit space physically with activities like stretching, or intellectually with the activities like readings. So the research topic of a souvenir proposed to take a critical look at the very idea of souvenirs. Too often souvenirs reduce the complexity of a place to a single object, failing to capture the essence of the site-specific experience. The topic was about rethinking souvenirs through the lens of nanotourism. So it's not about buying and owning a certain object, but it's about co-creation, exchange, education, and building a deeper, more personal connection between the visitor, the place, and the memory. So the first project dealing with souvenir was Somewhere Else, which was repurposing and reinterpreting the architectural elements in Plečnik's work. So souvenir, obviously, it's a reminder of a person, place, or event. And they have made a thorough research of what is available already in Ljubljana, of all the souvenirs that relate to Plečnik's themes or Plečnik's persona. And this is just a fracture of the catalog, which is vast. So instead of looking into this, they rather looked back on how Plečnik understood memory and finding the topic of souvenir within his work. So they came across of spolia and reuse, both principles that Plečnik was thoroughly using in his work. Most notoriously, spolia bringing some Roman remains that he found walking around the city and on his building sites, and then he displaced those elements in order to use them in newly constructed projects of his. So students said Plečnik left his souvenirs scattered throughout Ljubljana. They started to make a catalog of all these things, talking to all the possible experts you can find in Ljubljana, marking down maps where they have been found and where they were displaced. So eventually they built a thorough catalog of repurpose, reinterpret, of elements that Plečnik was, for example, finding in an old building that you see in the black and white photos. And those pillars had to be removed for the structural reasons, but he was using them in a local park somewhere else. So this catalog started to collect all of those kind of memories that Plečnik was working with, including those that he has brought back to his home. So how can this knowledge be visualized in space? So they took an example of the Roman head, which was integrated in the facade of St. Floria Church. And they kind of mapped the displacement. So they scanned the face, they produced a copy of it. They also created a little plinth with information, and they placed it back into the context or in the place of historic Emona, with a head telling you, I am somewhere else now. But the same on the other side, telling you the story and the information of all the others displaced objects and how you can find them in Ljubljana. So eventually they have created a non-linear path that sets you on a quest of discovering Plečnik's own souvenirs around the city. So the second project, which was also starting from souvenirs, is If Columns Could Talk, inviting individuals to find their own Ljubljana. So they said the project extends Plečnik's crowd of unusual columns to invite curiosity and individual projections into unexpected sites. So they looked at drawings and realizations of Plečnik's columns, maybe also finding some references to human body, and understanding also a set of columns as a whole, comparing it to forest, where you see and understand a collection of trees as a forest, as a completely different whole, as individual trees or columns. They each one tell their own stories, and they are each one very specific. So they started to kind of understand how those columns can be read differently and how columns are communicating stories, maybe the contexts that they are put in. They created, again, a thorough catalog of all Plečnik's columns you can find in the center, but they also understood how they are positioned in their respective contexts within those very specific places, in order to start experimenting with a column that was talking to people. So the column was the social experiment of telling the narrative to passers-by about the series of Plečnik's columns, and started to unveil a completely different view of the visitors, how they understand Plečnik's work, and specifically the element of the columns, but also gathering information from what the users kind of understood from those setups. They started to experiment with symbolic values to finally create their own version of a column that builds on Plečnik's ways of work or approaches, including reappropriating other elements to be recomposed in a completely different visual and symbolic value, but at the same time having a capital of a special function that always kind of reflected the context where they were put on. So in this case, a light, and the reflecting circles were also kind of reflecting the light from the sun. But they also placed these columns as an experiment in a completely different context, in the context of Ravnikar's work in the Republic Square, again with the column and its capital to start reflecting, maybe chromatically or in the shapes, reflecting the Ravnikar's architecture. So if columns could talk reimagines Plečnik's iconic columns as open-ended prompts scattered across the city. So placed in unexpected locations, these contemporary columns invite people to pause, think about their environment, and project their own meanings to it. Ljubljanica River is an integral public space that has the power to redefine how city connects with its inhabitants and visitors. So the topic that was explored by Plečnik in his many different ways. So it is about connection, the two things, or maybe it is about the disconnection that opens up some completely different opportunities on the river banks, as you're going to see. So the project Untouchable, Rewilding the City Center, started to understand all the aspects of Ljubljanica from infrastructural and social value, understand how many visitors and how many inhabitants are actually the users of the river banks, in order to kind of also structurally, spatially make an analysis of Ljubljanica running to the city center, to eventually decide for that little place exactly a few steps off the 3 bridges. So this is a hybrid drawing showing the floor plan combined with the views, the facades, and you see that all the 4 river banks around the 3 bridges, the 3 of them, they have already pretty much defined a certain program that relates to the users of the city, except on the right upper hand, which was their area of interest, where it was kind of an ambiguous place, which was not really kind of part of a public space of the city center. So this is this kind of in the intermediate green level, which is not really part of the water level, neither it's part of the city level. So they figured out that that door is closed at all times, except from some maintenance. So access is completely prohibited for humans. So they took this as an initiative to say that untouchable piece of land as a non-human sanctuary where humanity acknowledges its inability to exert absolute control. So they went in, analyzed all the plants that are already living there, and identify the possible users, solitary bees and other urban pollinators. So they set out to kind of create bug hotels, little structures that are going to be placed in those green, ambiguous ambients. So, of course, they emphasize the inaccessibility of the site, making the door bigger, but also carrying all the information about their research. And they tapped into the topic of rewilding, that we know how it is very important in the cities worldwide, addressing the new urban developments. So, drawing inspiration for Plečnik's sensitivity to urban nature, they designed an intervention that introduces pollinator-friendly plants and insects habitats. So the project becomes a powerful act of resistance, asking us to rethink what it means to care for a city today. Structures resonating materially to what Plečnik was using in his works, creating small habitats for first inhabitants right away. This was kind of erected. So instead of conclusion, the ultimate goal of this project was always beyond them just being conceptually strong, well-designed, and materially sound. So we also aimed for an afterlife, for the spatial and social integration of those projects into urban life, even after the workshop and the workshop participants finished and their creators left. So I'm showing here you 3 photos. We were really happy that weeks after the workshop was finished, local kids totally appropriated those chairs, even using it as a bridge, but also kind of integrated it in the combination of their own little home next to the riverbank. And the bug hotels are still there, so when you're walking by, you can have a look. And they have been welcoming bees and pollinators for a year already now. And last but not least, the exploration into Plečnik's own souvenirs. It is going to be published in this book with a collaboration of Faculty of Architecture and the City Museum. Lastly, this workshop wouldn't be possible if we wouldn't have generous support of our sponsors. Thank you. It is quite difficult to speak with the echo. I mean, I'm hearing myself with a half-a-second delay, so I'm sorry for that. It took a little bit longer. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Jožeta Butina Watson, who is a professor of urban design at Oxford Brookes University. What I like to emphasize is that she co-authored a book and an exhibition on Jože Plecnik on Oxford Polytechnic in 1983. So this was 3 years before the Georges Pompidou exhibition. So Jožeta will join us via Zoom, and I hope that's gonna work smoothly.
Thank you very much, Alyosha, for the introduction. And can I just ask, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me, okay. I'm delighted to be here and to be talking to you today. And I'm also very sorry that I can't be with you in Ljubljana. And what I have thought of presenting today is really my own journey in terms of trying to understand Plečnik in the context, particularly of urban design. And I would like to do that through sort of series of interpretations that I have put together that might help you in your workshops, but also in your debates. So first of all, I would like to introduce some of the current thinking that I have about Plečnik and his work from the theoretical perspective, which builds on the work that I did earlier in the early 80s. Explain how it fits within the morphological structure of the city, and then provide some conclusions. So just a few observations on the legacy of Plečnik's inquiry. So the book that we see on the left, which is Jože Plecnik, 1872-1957, Architecture and the City, came out as a result of my doctoral thesis on the morphology of the city of Ljubljana. And I came across this fascinating architect, urban designer, that kept intriguing me in terms of thinking about that he already did everything that we were talking in the 80s in our urban design studios. So I was wondering, how did one person of such magnitude could achieve all this in a short period of time, but also what new lessons we can learn from Plečnik. So the book was really accompanying catalogue for an exhibition that we did in partnership with Modern Art Oxford. And also it was originally really just to kind of provide biography and some information about the work of Jože Plecnik. But we were told, I was collaborating on the exhibition with colleagues Ian Bentley and Richard Andrews. We were told that audiences would like to know more about Plečnik and his legacy. So we wrote 5 essays or chapters in this book that present different viewpoints. So in addition to my co-curators of the exhibition, we also had articles by Peter Krečić and also Nace Šumi. The exhibition was also shown at the RIBA at the end of 1983-84. And they were very honored to host this exhibition, which showed largely Ljubljana portfolio of work, but also some examples from Vienna and Prague. Because Plečnik was also an honorary member of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and therefore they were very keen that we present this exhibition. It attracted quite a lot of attention, publicity. It was written about in major journals. And in addition to our own panels that we put as a photographic coverage of the period, largely in Ljubljana, we were also fortunate to be given on loan some of the original Plečnik's drawings. And that was really interesting to generations of architects and urban designers. So this early work later on led me to further explore Plečnik's work, particularly through the work on place identity. So some of these ideas I would like to share with you today. So looking at the kind of structure of my talk, were my original analytical debates about Plečnik that included functional, aesthetic, garden city, and morphological components. And this underpins very strongly the whole interpretation of place identity. Linked to that was also a very important townscape and imageability study, particularly the work of Lynch and Gordon Cullen. And in bringing a lot of my own students, they were really very interested to find out how the whole concept of imageability and legibility was evident in Plečnik's work. But today I would also like to focus a bit more on landscape urbanism and the participatory engagement through the use of the city, and also how we interpret Plečnik from many different perspectives. And then conclude in terms of how I see his work also in terms of that permanence, being a resilient city, as well as a healthy and restorative city. And in doing so, I would like to explore this through morphological sequence of both the Gradaščica and Ljubljanica rivers, but also connecting to the wider morphological structure of the city. So we know that Plečnik was very interested in the morphology and structure of the city of Ljubljana because he left a lot of notes. He talked about the emotional response that he got from the upper town around St. Florian's Church, but also the fantastic curve of the old settlement that links into Mesto and further afield, and the connections with the emerging new developments of the city. So although he doesn't belong to the School of Urban Morphology, I think his understanding of the topography, particularly links with the castle, the cultural landscape of the place in terms of its history, is very significant in terms of how we understand him today. So I was particularly intrigued about his plan that he produced in 1928. There are different dates. Some documents say it was 29, because he talked about this structure of the city as a cape, or what they call plasht in Slovene, I think. And that was very much to be a malleable system, whereby it wasn't fractured at any point in time, but allowed innovation at the local level. And it is this local level that I would like to focus my talk about today. So as part of the river sequence, I have also identified as part of my study that each sequence of the river that he designed also relates to particular identity or the character of its adjoining neighborhoods. And therefore, there are these 5 distinctive neighborhoods, and the key to it is really the main axis, which is the river, but also then bridges that connect different neighborhoods at the city. And starting with the schemes in Trnava, and it was interesting to see what you did in the workshop last year, is how he uses landscape components and townscape sequences. And this is something that perhaps I didn't pay much attention in my early research, but he uses trees, in my view, in the same way he uses architecture. So the natural components and the built form components are very much part of the same vocabulary. They define the spaces in front of the churches, like the church that we have in front of us. And also, as we have seen previously with the exercises on bridges, the bridges are more than just crossing points. They are spaces and there's places that define that contextual relevance. But that particular sequence also merges what we call rural landscape and also urban landscape. And in a progression through the area, we can see how it evolves in terms of its townscape sequences. So the views are very important, both through the river itself and the flow of the river, as well as the upper level in terms of the bridges, etc. But what's significant here is, particularly if we look at the slides at the bottom of the presentation, that it's also very closely linked to the landscape itself. So both the banks are very much part of this dialogue, as well as the use of different kinds of trees. So he uses horse chestnuts to define the axial avenue of that line, but he uses then weeping willows to create screening and transparencies in the area. And therefore, in that sense, I think he also creates these spaces. So I would argue what you have had in the beginning of the symposium today, that the river sequence, both in Gradaščica and Ljubljanica, also part of the public space because of the sense of enclosure and the way how biomass and bio elements become part of that interpretation. And at the same time, his bridges connect different neighborhoods. And in his notes that he put together in his plan, he was also saying that he would like to see a lot of variety of activity in Trnovo and Krakovo, the 2 neighborhoods, and he hopes that over time people are going to engage with different elements. But at the same time, he's also offering us what we would call today affordances, opportunities to use the spaces, the staircases, the terrace developments, etc., very much as a stage for us to become part of the interpretation of this scenario, and also very much understanding how we can feel in that place. So it's very much an emotional side. And in his letter to his brother, Andre, he was saying that he wanted to create this particular Gledashčica sequence very much as a linear park. So he was already thinking in terms of landscape structures becoming very much part of his architectural work. And then as we move through the Ljubljanica River into the city center, we pick up these messages, and Aljosha was talking about these souvenirs, and wherever you go, you find them in terms of pebbles, in terms of particular elements such as balls or lampshades or terraces, and you know that it was touched by Plečnik's hand. And this landscape sequence is very important because we see it as a connected spaces, and not just in terms of upper level of development and cascading down, but I think that the river Ljubljanica itself, he treated as public space, and we shall see later on how we can explain that. So as we move closer to the urban center, the intricate the design becomes even more important. And we have these townscape and legibility sequences that tell us where we are in the city. And today we are talking about the sense of orientation being very important for our mental well-being, for understanding where we are in space and place, but also in terms of building our own expectation in terms of place identity. And once we come to the bridge itself, this is the Cobbler's or Shoemaker's Bridge, we are inside an outside living room. It is very much part of the sense of enclosure, whereby this connectivity with the neighborhoods, with the old town, and also different new developments is very much articulated through these individual components, through lampposts, again, signalizing that we are in an enclosed space that is over time used for many different functions, for children to play there, for cafes, markets, etc. But it also shows what the director of the museum was saying earlier, what are the components of permanence and temporality. And in the last slide at the bottom, we can see how current architects and urban designers in Slovenia are adapting some of the approaches to the work that Plečnik did. So it allows the malleability, it allows us to intervene, to create new spaces on the basis of his own spaces. And equally, the sense of water is very dominant, and with the design of his steps going down into the river, in some of his notes, he was saying it's important for fishermen to go down, etc. He also talked about the river being very important in the past as navigational space, as food production in terms of food and various other fish and other harvests. And he was also talking about the layering of the city. So we have these different zones in terms of how we connect to different levels, which again, I think was part of some of the workshop last year. But as we move through the city, we become aware that the linkages are there with the neighborhoods surrounding the river. It's particularly interesting to see the spaces that he created in between the river and also the library, as well as the Vegova Street and Congress Square. And in his design top right, he was studying from an urban design point of view how he could create these connections. And if we look at the linkages between the reading room in the library and the castle, he was obviously trying to connect that in terms of the design of the building, how it connects to a wider space. But in terms of the spatial sequences, it's also interesting to see how he uses buildings, elements of incorporation of some of the souvenirs or artifacts that he found in the Roman part of the area, and then moving us towards the more contemporary approaches and interpretations. And he leaves riddles to us to answer, and we ask ourselves, why is this lamppost there? We go and explore these spaces. So he was very much aware that he wanted to share his own thoughts with us. He was giving us an interpretive trail that we could interpret in different ways in our approaches to understanding the city. But again, looking at some of the recent interventions in the Congress Square, but also the park adjoining it, is allowing current designers to work with that material. So I think this is very interesting to see how his projects and ideas are being taken on board today by different generations of architects and designers to make appropriate spaces, to create better quality surfaces, to take traffic out of some of the areas of the cities. And that opens up the possibilities in terms of what we can achieve with particular open spaces. But wherever we go, there is this constant relationship with the castle, and again, that supports very strong interpretations of place identity. The most interesting and challenging sequence on the river, Ljubljanica River, is approaching the Three Bridges or Tromostovje area. And here again, he shows masterly intervention in terms of connecting the engineering of the old bridge that was built mid-19th century by Francisco Comolo, and then creating two side bridges as a connection rather than creating one unified urban space. And in some of his notes that he put together adjoining the master plan, where that he wanted to create possibilities for new modes of traffic to go through, whilst at the same time allowing pedestrians to go through, to enjoy it, etc. And again, we can see over time that we can remove traffic from some of the areas, and they become public open spaces at a higher level. There is also an intriguing relationship between the bridges, the architecture that was there in the past, and also how he incorporated and unified this space through balustrades, through lampposts, and also, if we look at the bottom right diagram, we can see to what extent the spatial organization of Prešern Square, former St. Mary's Square, is very much unifying different areas of the city. It was historically a very important node in terms of trade, in terms of activity of traders, etc. And he uses that on board as a historical precedent, but he creates a much more modern interpretation of that space and the way how it can be used. So the space itself is very adaptable. And we can see over time that people are using it in terms of different activities, events, art events, religious celebrations, etc. But it is also the most memorable place in the parts of Ljubljana, particularly focusing on Plečnik's work. And at the bottom of the slide on the right, there is a study that my colleague Matej Nikšić and I carried out on how memories are constructed by users of the cities in Ljubljana, in terms of to see where are the key nodes, where are the key landmarks that people usually associate with in the interpretation of Ljubljana's place identity. So the orange marked areas are those that link Congress Square, Three Bridges, the river sequence, and also the linkages to the old part of the town. So we found that even ordinary people use Plečnik's vocabulary and Plečnik's design as part of their own interpretation in terms of place and place identity. Here we can also see what some of the theorists called creation of participatory aesthetics. And this is where, again, Plečnik, in my view, afforded us these spaces that he created, 3 bridges, etc., so that we can use them for different functions and activities. And in the work of David Novitz, who talks about participatory aesthetics, he says the cities are more than just architecture and landscape, etc. They are about people. And through the use of these spaces, we create new way of creating this participatory aesthetic. And at the same time, they're very strong in terms of supporting our memories. But then he also tries to unify the 2 sides of the river through the construction of the marketplace. And it's a very interesting concept because it's a very unusual building that tries to link different parts of the city. And if we look through the slides that we have, we can see the transparency that he created. So we always know where we are in space when we are using his river, etc. We can connect to the spaces beyond, and we know that we are in a particular time, in a particular space. So from my point of view, it's one of the very successful ways how external and internal spaces, again, can be co-created to provide a very interesting conjunction of these events. At the same time, he was also very practical in terms of creating this covered market, similar to his houses under a common roof, whereby traders could sell their produce, etc., whilst at the same time he gives it a very monumental building in a similar way to what we find with Covent Garden in London, Galleria in Milan, and other places. But he finds his own interpretation using these classical components to elevate this part of the city and link the 2 sides together. On the other side, where the building defines this public trading space, it's very interesting. He creates, again, this very open space defined by colonnaded arcades, and the space itself is very robust. It's very, very resilient. The architecture is permanent, but the spaces that we use are very much temporary. So we can co-create different events, use it for social gatherings, for cafes, and different activities, particularly in terms of the kinesthetic experience. It is full of sounds, smell, also food that is sold on the market, etc. So it is one of the key landmarks that we try to kind of identify as part of our journey. And then as we move away from the market on the other side of the river, it again provides this very defining component of the city. And again, it shows how different layers can be integrated. He also proposed the bridge here, the Butcher's Bridge, which is built by another architect in 2010, which he wanted to connect with 2 sides of the river. So this also indicates that even if the projects were not quite completed at the time he was working in Ljubljana, his ideas were now interpreted by new generation of architects. So we find that the cradle of his design components was very much part of this evolving structure. And the gateway, in terms of the river sluice, is very important. It symbolizes, again, both the exit and entrance into the city. And we can think of the whole area as a transition zone between different components, very much part of the urban landscape that we can find in the city. But the river itself is very much a platform for different events. And this is where I think, answering the question whether Ljubljanica River is public space, I think it is. And I think that Plečnik, again, with his arcaded banks and planting along the river, benches, trees, lamps, etc., provided a unified platform for these events to take place. And he was talking about this tactile experience of touching water, but also using the soundscape as an orientation part in the city as a journey. So Riva is also becoming social spaces where we participate through leisure events, art installations, music performances, light shows, and therefore the whole event is very much consolidated, both in terms of its architecture that Plečnik created, but also in terms of how we today use the place, how we interpret it, how we think of the space as being ours, not just being there to be looked at from a postcard or from a distance. So in concluding remarks, I think that his projects strongly support the interpretation of place identity, and this is why his work has been recognized by UNESCO. It is about his relationship to nature, to people. His architecture and urban design projects are shared by many different groups of residents, visitors, professionals, and others. He's very much linking, or was linking the city to its historical roots, whilst at the same time being very modern and supporting urban memories that we co-create as part of the experience of using the cities. And therefore, from that point of view, his work is very much inclusive, it's humanistic, it's shared by different groups, by children, by elderly, and others. But also we can see that he has created a very functional organization of the city, and also aesthetically pleasing in terms of the sequence that we can follow from imageability, but also townscape point of view. And also, if we look at the longevity of his work, how long it has lasted, and it will last for many more years to come, we can say that he has also created a resilient city, a city that is also positively responding to climatic change with his incorporation of planting, water, trees, etc. But it's also a restorative city in terms of our health, because the journey along the river, for example, can enhance our mental and physical well-being. And therefore we can say that in today's interpretation of Plečnik, he has created a truly unique experience in a period of time when many other designers were not even thinking about these different aspects. So I hope that some of this may help you when you are developing your own ideas for the projects. I want to thank various colleagues, particularly to Tadej Bolta, who generously loaned some of the images, equally Calliope Andrews and Richard Andrews, but also to my publication collaborators from the past, Ian Bentley, Richard Andrews, Peter Krecic, and Natsi Shumi. So I thank you all very much for listening to me, and I hope that some of the ideas I shared with you may be useful in your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgia. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Georgia, for your valuable contribution. I hope you heard the applause as well.
I heard, thank you.
Yes. Yes, we will move on, since we are in a delay, with our next speaker. And I'm happy to say that the delay is not there anymore. So that's perfect for you guys. And I would like to introduce Axel Vlodi, who is maybe representative of the youngest generation of researchers of Plečnik's work. So he is an architecture researcher, and he did recently a thesis entitled Jože Plecnik and Ljubljana, Identity and Language of Memory. But you are also here because you are currently working at the Center Georges Pompidou in Paris, and we are very keen to see your presentation.
So, it's okay? It works? Okay. So thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be able to speak about Plečnik in public. In fact, when I discovered Plečnik's work a few years ago in Belgium, I was surrounded by people, friends, researchers, who for the most part, thank you, knew little or nothing about this architect's work and life. Having just discovered his work and sometimes fascinated by what I had just discovered, the study and research I conducted at the time questioned, in fact, the issue of national identity and the language of memory. In fact, very much guided by the bibliographic material available to me at the time. And at the very end of my master's thesis defense, I received my degree leaving one question and answer to me. To what extent did Plečnik's architectural achievements truly contribute to the creation of a distinct Slovenian national identity, or were these projects partly due to circumstances and contextualizations interpreted as such over time? So today I will invite you to explore a particular aspect of Plečnik's architecture, but not in the usual way. We will not simply admire his buildings. I want us to focus on how his image, his work, and his figure have been recounted, interpreted, and ultimately stabilized historiographically. So first and foremost, the material used for this research, some of which you will see in this lecture, comes mainly from the public archives of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, which have been lying dormant for so many years. I would therefore like to express my special thanks to them, as well as to the Canadian Centre for Architecture and the Modern Art Oxford. So the central theme of my presentation will therefore be that Plečnik's international image is not given by his work, it's manufactured by publications, research, and exhibitions organized around this particular figure. So more specifically, the 1986 exhibition at the Centre Pompidou and its traveling versions seem to have written and fixed certain characteristics internationally concerning the reception of Plečnik. I would first like to briefly outline the theoretical framework for this presentation. The mobility turn, or paradigm shift based on mobility, is essential to understanding how the Plečnik exhibition at the Centre Pompidou in 1986 contributed to redesigning not only the perception of the architect, but also his very history in architectural historiography. So since the 90s, the social sciences have shifted from a static model to the recognition of mobility as a central actor in social, cultural, and spatial dynamics. As the mobility's paradigm shows, the movement of people, ideas, and things is at the heart of power constellations, the question of identities, and the microgeography of everyday life. Thus, it's no longer just a question of constructing or analyzing buildings at rest, but of tracking movements of a new historiography where history is made in motion. So this prism allows us to think of the exhibition not as a fixed archive, but as a mobile device and a historiographical actor. So Plečnik's reputation is forged in the surf through discourse and itinerant narratives. Each exhibition venue injects its own interpretation, heritage, academic, aesthetic, building an image of Plečnik. In this way, historiography becomes a weaving of specialized narratives rather than a linear narrative. So the mobility turn, therefore, implies that the history of architecture is a cartography of trajectories. So this lecture, therefore, focused on a specific practice which took the opposite tack to an architectural style that, at the time, had taken a modernist historiographical turn that we are all familiar with. Also in neighboring nations, such as Czechoslovakia, for example, whose artistic elite found Plečnik's work insufficiently innovative. So while figures such as Plečnik's were driven by a keen interest in early 20th century, and interwar societies, sensitivity and acceptance of general heterogeneity somehow necessitates a reversal of temporal reference points, guided by the notion of non-simultaneity within the history of architecture. However, this does not exclude the importance and existence of actors who develop works in a relevant and consistent manner, but they undoubtedly face the historical contradictions of modernity, transforming the work itself into a key of understanding these different tensions. So in other words, Plečnik's work and the analysis of its receptions allow us to understand the various issues of the time in a specific context, while at the same time attempting to examine the core of his approach. So the 1986 exhibition dedicated to Plečnik at the Centre Pompidou was a key moment in the international recognition of the Slovenian architect. It took place in an intellectual context marked by the emergence of postmodernism, the reevaluation of alternative modernities, and the desire of institutions to revisit figures marginalized by the dominant narrative of the modern movement. So this lecture aims to show that this exhibition and its itineraries did not reveal a stable truth about Plečnik, but rather produced a plurality of situated historiographical narratives dependent on national context and the visual regimes mobilized. In other words, talking about Plečnik in 1986 is not simply a matter of rediscovering a forgotten architect, but also of telling a story of how exhibition constructs and shifts the historiography of architecture. So first and foremost, it's important to put things into context. The exhibition at the Centre Pompidou is not the first exhibition on Plečnik, even if it seems to be the most important internationally. The reception of Plečnik's work began well before the 1986 exhibition, even during the architect's lifetime. So nevertheless, the cultural buzz surrounding his work and life seems to have been concentrated in the region where he was active, namely Prague, Vienna, Yugoslavia more broadly, and around Ljubljana. So the first notable exhibition with international reach appears to have been the one organized in Oxford in 1983, subtitled Architecture and the City. So the exhibition and catalogue are presented at the first publication to expose the work of Plečnik's most fertile period, his projects in Ljubljana from 1920 to 1957, to an audience outside Yugoslavia. It takes a broad approach, assembling a number of widely different but complementary views of Plečnik's architecture, as seen both from within Yugoslavia and from abroad, united by the common theme, architecture and the city. In this first catalogue in English, the beginning of a reflection on the reception of Plečnik's work, so Plečnik and the critics, traces the changing critical reaction to Plečnik's works, from the early student projects in Vienna through to the final schemes for Ljubljana. Nevertheless, the exhibition at the Centre Pompidou remains a historiographical hub, a shifting platform through which multiple narratives are weaved. As a result, Plečnik ceases to be an internationally stable or invisible figure and becomes a migrant icon. Inaugurated in 1986 on the original initiative and with the fervent support of François Burkhardt, this exhibition, originally entitled Unfinished Classicism Between Modernism and Slovenism, was a personal project led by Burkhardt, who had already plans to organize it when he was president of the International Design Center in Berlin. He then became director of the Center for Industrial Creation at the Centre Pompidou in 1984. I think it's important to understand that when it opened in 1977, the Centre Pompidou marked a break with the traditional approach to museums. Far from being a sanctuary dedicated to static collections, it was designed by Renzo Piano, Richard Rogers, and Gianfranco Franchini as a dynamic and multidisciplinary space. So the idea was to create a cultural crossroads where art, architecture, and design could interact in new ways. So this vision was embodied by the Center for Industrial Creation, whose mission was to integrate architecture and design into the museum's programming from its inception. So this model quickly had an impact beyond Paris. In the early 80s, there was a proliferation of museums and exhibition centers dedicated to architecture. The creation of the International Confederation of Architectural Museums in 1979 formalized this trend, conferring institutional legitimacy on architecture exhibitions and transforming them into a genuine medium of public interest. So exhibitions then ceased to be simple educational tools and became scenographic laboratories. They began to explore new ways of presenting contents, playing with the relationship between space, the public, and the works. So this evolution made it possible to offer more varied interpretations and highlight different perspectives on architecture. So from the outset, the Plečnik exhibition aims to be ambitious, and it will be, bringing together nearly 300 paper documents, original drawings, models built for the occasions, chairs, furniture, and a full scale of the 3 bridges that you can see here. At the beginning of the press kit, the exhibition is presented as dedicated to Jože Plecnik, a Slovenian architect and student of Otto Wagner. His architectural work is characterized by a rigorous ethic and a language composed of classical elements combined with specifically Slovenian themes. This links him to postmodernism and places him at the forefront of current event today. So from the very start, François Burkhardt insisted that the exhibition be itinerant, that Plečnik travel around Europe and internationally, before finding its long-term home in Slovenia. So the exhibition then traveled to Ljubljana, Madrid, Munich, Vienna, Karlsruhe, Milan, Venice, New York City, and Washington, D.C. In fact, the basic program was much more ambitious, reflecting both a desire to introduce the architect to a wider audience and a general buzz around his work at the heart of the debates of the time. So preparatory files mentioned Chicago, Cleveland, Brussels, Copenhagen, Lausanne, Barcelona, Belgrade, Montreal, and even some discussions about a potential exhibition in Japan in 1988. Although the traveling exhibition is a condensed version of the 1986 exhibition at the Centre Pompidou, it is still substantial, 132 panels to be presented in the form of vertical triptychs that we saw here on the left. 6 models, 160 original drawings, 10 chairs, and around 60 objects, all of which may or may not be adapted to the capacity of the exhibition venues. So we will try to quickly go through each stop in this exhibition to give you an overview, but the organization and the different scenographies will not be the focus of this reading. So the first stop on this journey is Ljubljana, starting on the 20th November 1986. Here we discovered that a roundtable discussion was organized around 3 points: general attitude towards Plečnik's works and personality, reflection and importance of his exhibition in Paris in wider geographical and temporal frames, and finally, Plečnik and the architecture of the future. These 3 themes already show that in Slovenia at that time, the subject was far from being the discovery of Plečnik's works, but at a time when his work was at the heart of certain stylistic debates, the organizing committee of the Ljubljana exhibition was already trying to project the analysis into the future while developing historiographical considerations. So next, here are a few glimpses of the exhibition in Madrid. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find so much information about the Munich's one. So this is the exhibition in Vienna. So we can see the reuse of the triptych panels and the models. And for Karlsruhe, the exhibition was held in the rather special context of the European Cultural Days in 1988. So the aim of these days is to initiate debates through a series of events, familiarizing not only cultural enthusiasts, but also the general public with the visual arts, music, cinema, video, and architecture. Each edition has a different theme, and this year's theme was the present. So to quote the city's cultural director, "When observing the present, one cannot escape the phenomenon of postmodernism, which is symptomatic of our era. This term therefore often appears when classifying new phenomena, cultural formations, and form of consciousness. Current debates on modernism clearly show that the term postmodernism cannot be used as a general diagnosis. And a characteristic of postmodernism is that temporal references before and after have become unrecognizable." So we already can highlight the importance of postmodernism in the concept of the present, which was at the heart of debates at the time, but also the debates between modernism and postmodernism, in which Plečnik was historically immersed for a very long time. So thanks to the archives of the organization of this exhibition, but also to a presentation that François Burkhardt was to give in Karlsruhe for the inauguration, we discovered that the local committee insisted on the subject of modernism and postmodernism. In a meeting report, Burkhardt is asked to highlight the broad impact of Plečnik's work on the end of modernism and on the development of the postmodern movement in architecture today. So I don't know how Burkhardt reacted at the time, but he already convinced of Plečnik's non-paternity with postmodernism, declared that Plečnik's theme is approached from the perspective of a liberated history of architecture, in which postmodernism can be understood as an attitude of openness. Postmodernism is not a style, but rather a concept that no longer seeks to understand history as universal, but as fraternal and composed of different elements, independent of one another. Indeed, the totality of phenomena can no longer be controlled scientifically, just as knowledge and the development of history can no longer be controlled globally. And Jože Plecnik built the Zakel House in Vienna and the University Library in Ljubljana, 2 works that must be considered decisive building of modernism. So after this exhibition, the installations will travel to Milan in 1988, for which an Italian catalogue will be published. After Milan, the exhibition remained in Venice for a month, before traveling to the United States, where it first landed in New York City at the Architectural League in 1989, partially abandoning the original scenography and the triptych panels. Finally, before returning to Ljubljana, Plečnik was presented one last time at the end of 1988 in Washington, D.C., at the American Architectural Foundation, which, judging by the presentation booklet of the time, seemed to me to be a conservative American institution, particularly interested in Plečnik's classicizing language. We now come to the points where, through these various exhibitions, the question of reception arises. In addition to the exhibition event itself, these few years of traveling have led to the production of articles, conferences, roundtables, discussion, which have stirred up Plečnik historiography while cementing his figure in current debates. So in this way, reception studies tend to focus primarily on how cultural works are understood by the public in relation to places, periods, and social, cultural, and political contexts, in order to understand how this understanding is linked to the interface between the work and its use. These theories seek to focus the study on the dissonance and negotiation between the work and the viewer. In reality, the very notion of reception invokes a number of more or less related considerations, such as aesthetics, spatiality, temporality, and subjectivity. So these subjective aspects call for distinctions to be made between, for example, reception determined by the recipients and the study of the effects produced by the object itself. Here, the notion of historical deviation or expectation deviation does not only refer to a deviation in phenomenological temporality, but also to differences introduced and embodied by multiple modes of information. So a work or project is rarely received or exists independently of the projected world that is also communicated, or in other words, its historical, social, or political horizon, for example. Works or projects seem to be permeable to the events of concrete historical reality. So in other words, depending on the prevailing trend or dominant style of the era in question, their reception is subject to its context. So a relationship between historical inscription and new production therefore seems to exist, while raising question about the homogeneity of a potential simultaneity or temporal shift between the current and present states of system and the development of material production. In order to discuss the methodology used for this lecture, the work involved gathering and finding a significant number of press articles, both specialized and non-specialized, in French, English, German, Italian, and Spanish, linked to the exhibitions. So for the time being, the corpus was based on around 60 articles of varying length, and each article has been translated and catalogued. By the way, it should be emphasized that the translation of these articles already produces a more or less significant bias naturally created by the phenomenon of translation, insofar as certain words or expressions are sometimes not always translatable. So next, in order to understand Plečnik's historiographical construction at that time, and to understand the phenomenon of reception behind this temporary buzz linked to the exhibitions, each piece of writing was analyzed in terms of its contents in order to ultimately identify specific categories that reveal the main themes surrounding Plečnik and his work by the time. So the categories were created naturally after the facts, based on the articles themselves. The research also focused on the specific characteristic of each article, disregarding general information common to most articles, such as bibliographical details, for example, concerning Plečnik's life. So the following categories will therefore be presented in order of occurrence, from the topic most frequently addressed in the articles to those least frequently mentioned. So to begin with, we will discuss Plečnik as a national and post-imperial narrative. So far from the theoretical debate on postmodernism, the exhibition was an opportunity to reaffirm the figure of the architect as a builder of national and urban identity. His contribution to the city of Ljubljana can be seen as a founding act, giving the capital its symbolic landmarks, the National Library, the triple bridges, squares, and civic institutions. He is celebrated as a national hero, and this interpretation fits into a particular context. So Yugoslavia in the 80s marked by a reconfiguration of identity and culture, which saw Plečnik as a guarantor of continuity, to be fast. Thus, the international exhibition reinforces a narrative already present locally, where national historiography takes precedence over imported critical frameworks, revealing how the same exhibition can be reinterpreted through the prism of local expressions. So for each category, I will show some example of article. On the Spanish one, for example, we can read that Plečnik had an approach that relates to Yugoslav nationalism in the 20s, a period when young Balkan republics such as Slovenia began a passionate search for national identity. On the German one, titled An Architect's Vision of New Slavism, we can read that a look at Plečnik's work shows how much caution and discernment should be exercised with the term Central Europe, Plečnik and Masaryk's vision of the new Slavic style, an expression of the democratic and Western orientation of the Western Slavic people, was geographically linked to the Central Europe without, however, attaching itself to the idealized remnants of the Danubian monarchy. And in a French article, we can read that in addition to his religious faith, he also had a strong national faith. He wanted to express and glorify Slovenian identity. He nationalized the antique by incorporating Slovenian folk traditions. So the second most recurring theme is, of course, Plečnik's stance on the famous war of styles, so modern, postmodern, classicist. In fact, in Paris in 1986, the Centre Pompidou presented itself as the ideal place to reinterpret Plečnik through the lens of postmodernism. So the exhibition catalogue emphasized his eclecticism, his taste for columns, and his use of references to antiquity. In this narrative, his architecture was reduced to a referential aesthetic, aligned with the ongoing debates around Venturi, notably cited by Burckhardt for a reading of Plečnik's work. By seeking to place Plečnik within the context of French critical discourse, the exhibition produced an image that had a lasting impact on international reception. So this episode illustrates how an exhibition can fabricate an opportune ancestor, mobilized to fuel current debates, rather than to convey the complexity of a body of a work. So for the first article, for example, we can read that after modernism, corrupted by senseless mass production, left a bland taste in architecture, and after postmodernism was proclaimed, welcomed with joy and rejected with disgust, the history of architecture turns to the precursor of modernism. On the one hand, they form the basis of Mies van der Rohe's work, and on the other, their formal language is linked to current postmodernism. The following article attributes the authorship of postmodernism to Plečnik as indisputable, while at the same time emphasizing Plečnik's Slovenian character. And finally, a pioneer of postmodernism, Dan, who also made the blending of style across the centuries one of his theoretical foundations. The last category I represent here does not really qualify Plečnik's work, but, and I was also surprised by this during my research, a large number of articles offered reflections and considerations directly related to historiography and Plečnik's idiosyncratic nature within the history of architecture. So here the reflections developed an approach that goes beyond simple journalistic reception. The aim is to situate his work within a broader history of architecture, comparing it with other figures such as Loos, Gaudi, and Borromini, for example, and opening up a critical debate on labels. The contributions presented here seek to articulate several dimensions. So the comparison between architectural canons, critical positioning, and cross-disciplinary analysis beyond the Slovenian sphere. So they thus aim to offer readings that are comparative, transcanonical, and historiographical, allowing us to reflect on Plečnik's place in the history of architecture and how his work can be classified and interpreted. So for example, Plečnik has been described as both a Slavic Gaudi and a classicist, with a postmodern perspective. I see no connection with Gaudi, even though both were pioneering architects driven by religious obsession. Gaudi's linguistic boundary lay between Islam and Spain, while Plečnik's lays between the Roman and Byzantine worlds. Gaudi was the son of a coppersmith and studied from roundness. Plečnik was the son of a carpenter and studied from flatness. One had surrealist Dadaist intuitions, the other realistic metaphysical ones. On an American article, we can read that Plečnik's work is challenging. In addition to its unusual nature, it's uneven and unpredictable. His achievements have remained obscure for three reasons. The first is his very originality. Plečnik's work was and remains difficult to categorize or catalog, but that doesn't matter. Since the First World War, these cities have been virtually subjected to a kind of intellectual iron curtain in the intellectual and avant-garde capitals of the West. Here we can read that it was only out of pure canness that architectural history retained on the margins of its clear-cut heroes a few rather bizarre characters lost in strange reveries, far removed from the great anonymous and international movements to conquer modernity, singular expressionists, anti-rationalists, eccentrics, originals, lonely creators from Philadelphia or Barcelona, Glasgow, or the suburb of Amsterdam. And on the last one, up, so titled Not a Precursor to Postmodernism, it is astonishing to see how much our understanding of interwar architecture has evolved in recent years. For a long time, on the one hand, we saw modernism supplanted or suppressed in the 30s by movements ranging from nationalism to reactionism. On the other hand, we saw all these movements that owed their rise to a quasi-global conservative revolution. Overall, this view is not wrong at all. However, it does not take into account the many intermediate forms or regional particularities. It is particularly wrong when we consider the years after 1930 as the first end of modernism. The simple promotion of modern construction by fascist Italy contradicts this Manichaean scheme. Even for Nazi Germany, exhibitions and publications have highlighted a much more nuanced situation. Finally, it should not be forgotten that in smaller European states, such as the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, and Switzerland, modernism experienced its first boom precisely in the 30s. This is reason enough to say goodbye to simplistic cliché and discover more and more regional and personal achievements. So here I have selected only the most prominent topics, but obviously other topics were also widely discussed. Among them are Plečnik as a defender of a classic, the technical achievements of Plečnik with the use of concrete, and several articles focusing on Plečnik as a figure and as a man. Finally, some articles venture into local comparisons, such as Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright in the United States, or Boulet and Ledoux in France. And it's also worth noting that Viennese newspaper tend to emphasize Plečnik's Viennese character and his connection to Wagner. Finally, although this was not the main focus of this research, it's interesting to consider the visual system surrounding Plečnik. In other words, after examining the circulation of texts, we should look at the circulation of images, linking Plečnik to international visual imaginaries. So without going so much into the theoretical details of iconology and the conditions of image production, the notion of motif as conceived by Erwin Panofsky is relevant here in the sense that it's a question of noting that the details in a pictorial representation, explicit knowledge, and more precisely recognition, the realization that this is that, the perception of the nameable object, and all this obviously responds to the common mental construction linked to the circulation of images and the choice, conscious or not, to set these images in motion. So for Plečnik, within this selection of press images from the period, if we try to be quick, I would say that three motifs or three buildings stand out in particular. The triple bridges, the Zackel House, but above all, the Church of the Most Sacred Heart. And for me, it's not just any representations, but those of the interior of the tower, particularly evocative of architectural elements linked to the modern architectural movement. I would also like to point out that only one magazine highlights Plečnik's work on objects and furnitures. It's an issue of Casa Vogue, an interior design magazine. And only one magazine places Plečnik's work in an urban context and analysis, namely the July-August 1988 issue of Domus. And finally, it should be noted that these exhibitions led to the production of a catalogue containing a significant amount of theoretical considerations on Plečnik's work. There have therefore been 5 publications on Plečnik in 3 years, first in French and then translated into Spanish, Italian, German, and English. I'm not sure whether this catalogue has been translated into Slovenian or not, but in my opinion, these publications have contributed to a certain stagnation in the understanding of Plečnik around certain predominant themes. So to conclude, what can we take away from all this? I would say that the 1986 exhibition and its traveling versions did not reveal a true Plečnik, but produced a multiplicity of situated narratives, postmodern Plečnik, national Plečnik in Slovenia, Wagnerian Plečnik in Vienna, and these narratives are not mutually exclusive, but they form a mosaic that testifies to the decisive role of exhibitions and mediation in the construction of architectural historiography. It seems important for me to study the historiographical construction of certain architectural figures. If we look at the national narrative of Plečnik, for example, the deputy mayor of Ljubljana in 2007 said that perhaps we ought to dispel the myth of how the master supposedly respected the context and the identity of a place when he was in fact inventing the historical and cultural context so as to shape the space in his own way. The message of his relationship with the existing is, after all, clear and ambiguous. The identity is not given once and for all. In reality, we are reinterpreting it and shaping it anew all the time. So we know, for example, the origin of Plečnik's national figure, and we also know that the Venetic theory, on which his life's work is based in a way, is a pseudo-history that experts have described as unfounded. So rereading this reception today means understanding that Plečnik is not a stable figure but a field of successive projections, revealing the critical debates. over time. This case invites us to think more broadly about exhibition as historiographical laboratories. And so the existence of cultural relativism means that actions within a culture, subculture, or movements would in fact be understood within its own value system. Nevertheless, we should perhaps not consider that no other values can be taken into account, but this relativism still seems closely linked to the question of architecture, both in its learning and design, but also in its reception. So the work would therefore seem to be comprehensible through a succession of systems, through its own existence as a work, and also thanks to its general relationship with history. However, it could rightly be said that no text has been written to be read and interpreted philologically by philologists, or I would add, by historians with the eye of the historian. This reflection on the relationship between the work, its reception, and the historical nature of this process leads, in reality, to a certain negation of the transmitting element, which is above all linked to active entity, beyond the reflexive and historical analysis of the production. So finally, the author, the production, and the receiver each develop, in turn, a potential to produce, in a way, history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Axel, for your really thorough research and work that you have put into your presentation. Respect. Thank you also for taking us through this historical journey, and thanks for your own insights that you have shared with us. So let me now please welcome Luca Scansi, an architectural historian, associate professor at Politecnico in Milano, and he will take us on a short excursion through the post-war architectural practice in socialist Yugoslavia, finding continuities with Plečnik's spatial culture. So the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jože, for inviting me. It is really a great pleasure to be here in front of so many friends. It's very strange to talk with all of you in English. It's also scary because in the Dežela Plečniko logo, as Slovenia is, it's very complicated to speak about Plečnik, so I decided not to talk about Plečnik, but about a kind of legacy that I see in the socialist Yugoslavia post-war architectural tradition. And I will start with this peculiar monument. If you climb up on this Matić Poljana, it's a highland 1,000 meters above the sea level in Gorski Kotar. It's between Rijeka and Zagreb. You will have the chance to experience probably, in my opinion, the most peculiar and intriguing land art intervention that was realized in the post-war Yugoslavia. It's a kind of, Matić Poljana is a kind of long plateau, a kind of highland with very gentle slopes. It's very, very beautiful landscape. And in the middle of this valley, along this unpaved road, you will find 26 standing stones of various shapes, a kind of contemporary menhirs set in a very slight and precise curve. We are talking about this monument dedicated to 26 frozen partisans, a tragedy that occurred in 1944 during the escape of the partisans from probably the most important partisan hospital in Croatia during the Second World War. It's called Drežnica, who was under attack of Ustaše and Nazis. And the partisans left during February of 44, left this hospital, started to walk for 40 kilometers in this highland, and then many of them died frozen under the winter of Buria, so the North Monument. So if we analyze this monument, and especially the spatial arrangement of this monument, we will notice a series of different architectural themes. First, these upright stones draw a very precise geometric curve that, you know, that geometry, like every abstract act, is totally opposed to nature, no? So, however, at the same moment, this opposition, which I will discuss a little bit later, between geometry, abstraction, and nature, is totally denied at the material level, no? These objects are made of local stones, they are chosen from the local quarries, and they are practically untreated, as a slogan of these years was saying, totally as found. And in this sense, these rocks, as, let's say, as figures, act totally, let's say, contextual, we would say, with the words of today. Without any doubt, we can consider this project as really materially contextual, or as it was calling at that time, site-specific. The third theme we grasp while analyzing this monument is the topic of the treatment of these stones. They are of different dimensions. In fact, composed, it's not one stone, are two stones linked together but by an iron bar that is invisible. And they're not equally separated one from each other. So again, we find a kind of, we say, abstraction and contextuality in the spatial disposition of these stones. By the principle of analogy, we experience the movement as a column, no? A slow progression of people, each entity with its own characteristics, difficulties, heaviness, no? Each with his own pace and hesitation. The fourth topic, and maybe in my opinion the most important, is the one that refers, I cannot see anything with the glasses, right? I have to read without glasses. The fourth topic, as I said, the more important one, is what I call the process of perception, or better, the process of interaction which the architect creates between us, as the perceivers, and the work of art. There is no centrality, no strict, let's say, monumental focus, which is very strange for a monument. No, there is not an altar, a sculpture, a central point, but just this kind of memorial flow. We experience the monument spatially, no, continuously walking through time, space and time, and discovering step by step the diversity of the single stones, and especially their spatial relationship with the context in which they are positioning. Learning many things about nature, about how it ends, how it finishes in the woods, no? And where the monument in itself disappears, or if you come from the other side, where this monument maybe really starts. There is another topic which I like very much. The fifth theme is the topic of, today we would call in the Carlian way, the topic of participation. The monument was erected by the local forestry workers and the local subnor, druga boraca, I don't know how to say it in English, but let's say the former partisans. And instead, let's say, producing the usual architectural projects with drawings and landscape design, the architect, who we are now introducing slowly, Zdenko Sila, approached the creation of the monument directly on the spot. He placed living people in a real and corporeal column, which he could model, observe, and position. No? It was 1966. And in 1966, you will understand later why this date is important, 26 forest workers and former partisans participated in this task. The position of the single stones and their dimensions and combination were marked on the ground. No? And then he asked the partisan to bring 1 year later a stone of different dimension. And then they built it in this way. So, to make it a little bit shorter, the more we analyze this monument, the clearer it becomes that nothing is really accidental. All the themes are the result of a kind of project, no, of desired effects. invented by an architectural hand, by a skilled architectural hand. And if we think about these topics, especially the dialectical tension that I called between abstraction, so the geometry, and the contextual operation, so the space, the material, we realize that the monument is, Matić Poljana is quite peculiar, especially for Yugoslavia of these times. Peculiar when we compare it with the other operations of this time, the great sculptures of Dušan Jamonja, Bogdan Bogdanović, Miodrag Živković, which are mostly abstract sculptures, beautiful, incredibly powerful, that create monumentality, but at the same time create centers in which we consume the memory, in front of which we consume memory, rather than experience this interaction between us, the act of perception, the monument, and the landscape. So its reasons, or better roots, in my opinion, might be sought somewhere else. As we said, on one side we have this dialectical tension between the act of abstraction and contextuality, and on the other hand we have a peculiar spatial interaction between us and the artwork. We are talking about themes that characterized, let's say chronologically, an almost very, very parallel phenomena. Land art in the United States of America. It's just an example. Spiral jetty, famous spiral jetty by Robert Smithson. Paradigmatically recalls exactly the same themes. We are in mid-60s. Now you understand why I said 1966, 1 year before. Artists were here in the United States, in the topic of the land art, creating artworks outside the galleries, outside the museums, making landscape, both the subject and the material of the monumental creation, and, of course, experience. And landscape, not only visually, represents the protagonist of this artwork. And additionally, it is the landscape that becomes the material of the work. Mud, stones, water, everything that we find. And furthermore, another very important for us topic, in general, the topic of land art, and in general, the phenomena of the minimal movement art is that the most important thing that we perceive these objects walking through time and space, being into it, and experiencing this conflict between abstraction that is made by the geometries and the space and the nature, of course. Both in, as I said, in the desert, in the beautiful spaces of the American nature, but also in galleries, with these abstract objects continuously change the shape of the space that every time interprets the space itself. As Rosalind Krauss, the great theoretician, American theoretician, reminds us, both in land art and in minimal art, the meaning of the sculpture moves from that classic, let's say, private, intimate, psychological space to a public, to a natural, cultural, collective space. And the artwork is not anymore autotelic, so it's self-referential, but is something which we will find the total relationship. It's a relational one, so no autotelic, but the relational one between itself, us, and the context. Of course, one of the most important things is just to say that the monument on Matić Poljana is not the only one Yugoslavian monument that we can associate with the phenomena of the artworks, the American artworks of the 60s and the 70s. Zdenko Kolacio, crucial figure for the Yugoslavian culture monument of monuments, who was very close to Sila in these years, and created monuments that were strikingly close to the work of certain masterpieces of minimal art. And not only practically, but also theoretically. In one of his reflections, very, very good writer, extremely acute, really theoretician, I would say, Corazio states how the menhirs, the dolmens, no, and cromlechs enriched the work of modern sculptors. No? He is, of course, referring to the minimal art, and said the search for new ways of expression has prompted artists to look for their very origins, to start from tabula rasa. Minimal art, with its extremely simple forms, attempts to express the very essence of the idea, stripped of all unnecessary additions. Minimal art, no, and land art, in its geometric simplification and spatial interaction, with the perceiver, no? And this interaction with the perceiver is clearly associated by Corazio to the prehistoric memorials, the origin of minimal art he sees in prehistory. Therefore, we witness in Yugoslavia in these years perfect consciousness of the parallelism of these practices. No? In the precise moment when experimentation with the new typology of sculpture, statuaria, we would call it in Latin, or better, a new typology of sculptural memorials, begin, one which will bring architects and artists to conceive artistic objects that will go really beyond what traditional statuary was. So, one thing that we have to specify, and I absolutely don't believe in any relationship between Yugoslavian architectural practice and the American one. I don't believe in it. But it should be really specified that there is substantial difference between what was going on in the US and in Yugoslavia. And that lies, of course, in the simple function of these architectural and artworks. So Smithson, Judd, Heitzer, no? They were producing conceptual operations, no? And their sense stopped at the conceptual level. They didn't go further. No? Where is the concept? The concept is in evoking this participatory norm of us that visit the space and interact through the hinge of the artwork with the landscape. While in Yugoslavia, we were doing completely different things. This was a didactic machine, didactic not operation, to teach about memory. And memory was what? The memory was that these horrible things happens in these spaces, and we had to experience on the place of the events what happened through this analogy, process of analogy. So I would, in order to, let's say, go a little bit further in this reading of these techniques, of spatial techniques of evoking memory, I would like just to show you other two projects made, one by Zdenko Kolacio, Zdenko Sila, and the other one made only by Zdenko Sila, in which these perceptual relations that I mentioned with this monument, you will see that it's not occasional, but actually is a practice that each single monument is exploring. We are in the beginning of the 50s, 1953. Here you have, I sometimes call it a monument of the primary structures of socialism. Why? The primary structure was the title of this minimal art exhibition that was held in the Jewish Museum in 1966 in New York. Here we have really the primary structures of the first monuments, the obelisk and the sarcophag. The two elements that are somehow living in the production of the monuments of these years. It's interesting that when we observe the primary structure, there is nothing particular. But in the moment when we step inside, we get close to these objects, it's very interesting that these elements are positioned in an incredible spatial relational way. We enter to the plateau and we are called to participate with the individual part, let's say, to the memory of the individual of this memorial. This is Vladimir Gortan, maybe probably one of the first victims of fascist dictatorship in Istra in the 1930s. Vladimir Gortan is buried in this sarcophag. Now, this is the private memorial relationship that I, as a visitor, have with who is buried. Then I walk a little, I turn around, and I see that this obelisk is not positioned in my axe, but in another axe, calling to the bell tower of the close village, Beram, Vermio in Italian, where Vladimir Gortan was born. And on the top of this sarcophag, you can find it's written, the people of Istra. This is the people of Istra donating in order to memorize the heroic act of so collective memory and private memory are intersecting, coexisting. Another monument which I like very much, Tichan. Zdenko Sila is called to make this project. It's a horrible story. It's September 1943. The Italians leave Istra. The local partisans organize themselves. They know that Germans are coming, Nazis are coming, and on this crossing they make a kind of now they're staying there. Now they're trying to stop the Germans. The Germans arrive and they just go through, and all these partisans unfortunately die in this battle. So Zdenko Sila again does an operation of spatial didactic operation of teaching us what happened here. From afar, we see this really military disposal of these colossal elements, stone elements, which are against upright. Then, as we go closer, we understand that these elements are not so unified, but actually they are slowly, let's say, positioned, one in front, one less, one on the right and left. So this collective memory starts to individualize. And the most interesting thing is then when we come really in front of these objects start to talk about. One was a peasant, the other one was a worker, the other one was anyway, there is an act of personalization of the memory starting from one point to the other. So this spatial shift produces a transformation of a message. Sorry, I lost myself. Allora, 6, 7. I already read this. Okay. In conclusion, I'm going toward more or less 10 minutes. In conclusion, what should be furthermore explained in the reason for this central role assigned to the process of perception? We must forget that the majority of Yugoslavian war monuments were built on the sites, of course, of the tragedies that actually took place. From the first years after the war, we not only witnessed the demand, if not the necessity, from the victims to remember, but we can also trace a theoretization sustained by artists and art historians to interpret these historical moments in the places where this happened, as I said before. And here we now introduce the reflection of Zdenko Sila, who Zdenko Sila was, and this sensibility. Where does this come from, if he cannot really share this with the rest of Yugoslavia? Well, Zdenko Sila was in fact Slovenian, half Slovenian, half Czech, and attended the Ljubljana School of Architecture and was a Plečnik student. And already, let's say, in 1952, let's say, many years before the boom of the land art, the Slovenian architect, we enter in this other context, Marian Šorli, selected on the mountain, under the Storžič mountain, in the middle of a forest, this massive rock. And this rock was erected together with the veterans, no? To celebrate that spot where, during the war, this Storžič battalion was founded. And same kind of participatory development that and it was quite common in these years, quite common. So the aim somehow is to bring to life, as a kind of really modern menhir, an almost primordial gesture that becomes a memorial, something that surely will later define, you know, at the place of the occurrence. The value of this operation is not only to be found in the choice of the, let's say, place for the sculpture. As we mentioned, many sculptors do that, and architects do that in the place. But the value is to be found more in, if we again borrow the American terminology, the purely site-specific operation. The erection of the monument, which is between architecture and sculpture, there is almost no difference, in the form of the stone rock, or, as in other very famous example, in form of the mute pentagonal bench, placed around a tree, a trunk, where a tragedy occurred. A partisan was hanged, no, on this tree. Something similar, you know it very well, was made a few years later, 1961, by Stanko Kristal. At the spot, no, what once was Hospital Pavla, in western Slovenia, Kristal erected 3 iron beams, no, and a massive untreated rock. In very interesting way, no, the contextual act and abstract act really coexist in a really surrealistic project. This heavy stone, which is a local element, no, is paradoxically floating. And in this sense, of course, is abstracted, no? While the material that is totally foreign to the spot, so iron, no, behaves contextually. You read it, no, as a part of the forest, no, as the part of these very thin trees that you can find on the background. These all are single artifacts, surely Kristal, no? In Matic Poljana we have a very complex thing, no? As we said, set, a movement, memorial flow, no? Negating the centrality of the monument. No? Here we have this. No? So, of course, we have to deal with another conceptual step, no? Made by Edvard Ravnikar in a project that you already know, which has all these elements. No? We have a sculpture, but the sculpture is not really the central part. It's just one of the elements that we find walking all around. But the conceptual step made by Ravnikar was really in his article, Arhitektura skulptura in slikarstvu. Scusate, sorry, I again lost myself because I missed the pages. Yes, the explanation of this thing of the memorial flow, the relationship, was theoretically explained by Edvard Ravnikar in his famous essay, Arhitektura skulptura in slikarstvu, 1964, where Ravnikar not only claims that art must and can, of course, conquer new spaces, that art must not only stop playing an exclusively decorative role, but become a socially engaged art, as he calls it, that artwork not only needs to be brought closer to the people, so out of the galleries and get close to those who the monument is dedicated, to the common people, but especially that architects and artists, with their research and their production, must give a new form to a new type of art. And he sees the solution in the search for something that characterized visual arts practically since ever, and didn't really have the answer and the right definition and development during modernism. He called this the new form of synthesis of art. In our case, that we are exploring, the synthesis of architecture and sculpture. This synthesis is representing in nothing other than in this interactive spatial relationship between the environment, the artifacts, and of course us, the fundamental elements, as perceivers, the fundamental elements of this interaction. Without pushing the investigation of the genealogy of Matic Poljana too much in history, it's nonetheless impossible not to mention that this spatial sensibility we're discussing now, this perceptual process, is a lesson that all these Slovenian architects and probably also artists learn from their master. Here comes Plečnik. I lost a little bit of slides, sorry. His built examples that attest the awareness to this topic are really endless. And in this context, I will mention just this case that in my view is somehow paradigmatic. You know, the Murka Pavilion is a small wooden pavilion set up as a resting spot for the local nuns in the convent. To reach it, we are forced to climb and leave, and reach, and its position somewhere, or of course, changed its position recently, but stand a kind of filter between the woods and the open space from the convent to the space. We realize this relationship, these spatial relationships, when we finally enter under the covered space, which is surrounded by these 6 wide trunks, which of course is a Zemperian interpretation, okay, but this is, let's say, tectonically, spatially, it's really, really incredible. And this spatial effect is, in my opinion, impossible to describe in words. You have to feel it, as Donald Judd brings you, Rich Smithson brings you to the thing. You have to go there and understand the relational force of those elements. So through the pavilion, at the very edge of the forest, thanks to this artifact, so the pavilion, at one point we drop into the forest. And this is not allowing simply, like a kind of pergola through which I look the landscape. It's not this, or it's not only this. We are in the forest, but we are not in it. We are in the pavilion, but it does not represent any central space, but just a transitional spatial filter between us and nature. And the material of a pavilion is not only contextual, but make us drown spatially. So being contextual means that you are drowned spatially into the woods. In an instant, we experience this interaction between the natural environment, the artifact, the pavilion, and us. And we experience the whole that I have called interactive space. I repeat, the synthesis of these 3 elements that make the experience of space: perception, artifact, landscape. This is just to conclude the route I see in Sila's monument, kind of, as I call it, land art before the land art started, and invented, let's say, as a brand. But surely what the post-war architects, so Sila, Colazio, Ravnikar, many others, achieved is the transformation of this empathic process that in Plečnik was latent, inherent in almost all of his projects, that is imbued in this culture of Raumkunst, the 19th century, starting from Wölflin, Camillo Sitte, etc., etc. These architects of the socialist times changed this let's say, perceptual thing, spatial project, into a cultural and social experience of the socialism and its revolutionary ages. When the new public, the common people, the survivors of this lacerating and disastrous war, the fighters became the subjects of the experience of space, the experience of memory, and ultimately also the experience of architecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca, for a fantastic breakdown of relationships and all historical underlayers of the observer, art, and memory. So that brings me to our final presentation, final speaker of today. I'm really having a lot of pleasure to introduce Andras Palfi. He's an architect and founder of forward-thinking practice, Jabrnek and Palfi in Vienna, but also a long-term professor at the Department of Design and Theory of Design at the Vienna University of Technology. So he will contextualize Plečnik in Vienna, comparing his two prominent buildings there. Andras, please welcome, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Very glad to be here. When you called me that I have to give a lecture for students from the AA, and as I understood tonight, even for more than them, I was thinking about the time when I was studying architecture, and I was between two hyperbole branches in the middle. One of those branches was postmodernism, and the other branch was Plečnik, Wagner, historism, highly quoted by the teachers. So the only escape route that I had was into the tabula rasa of modernism, into another land, call it like that, or in an old land. And there's a day where you grow out from your post-pubertarian architectonic shoes, you return, and you start to understand qualities, and after all the qualities in the mentioned works of Jože Plecnik, whom I appreciated very much from the beginning, but I never found my way into it. Later on, I understood the high quality of modernism that is in these buildings, and in particular in two buildings, and I wanted to point out also the context where they came into existence. And I also had the possibility to visit the studio of Peter Zacherl, so I dived into the plans of the Zacherl house. I also had the chance to benefit from a friendship with Boris Podreka, so I went to see his studio and to get his opinion on the Heiligengeistkirche, both two projects that always fascinated me, and I will tell you then for what reasons. If we return to Vienna in 1854, there is a little note in the public press saying that the emperor wants the city to be changed into a modern city. And this starts a process that is then closed in 5 years later with the projection of the so-called Ringstraße. Now what we see here is the historic map of the city, of the medieval city of Vienna, surrounded by fortifications and a green area called Glacis, which has the use of a defense area against artillery, and in this sense also the artillery of Napoleon made understand that it's not anymore of sense to keep these fortifications. Now the idea was to bring down the fortifications, to make this ring, and what the ring does is nothing else than to connect two pieces of the city as we see them here. The historic center, the Glacis, as this green area, as this huge park around the historic city, and the outskirts, the suburban area. Now this defense area is changed completely into that what we see here now. It's a later image that I show you, but the principles are in this kind of restoration of the city, not to destroy the city, but to connect the inner part, the historic part, with the outskirts, with the suburban part. The radial roads are kept on in their function, so the city is tied together, it's not destroyed, it's reunited. And this is maybe one of the basic parts of this intervention, which is then gathering around a lot of new functions, like museums in another scale, like a parliament that is, as typology was unknown, like a railway station, like grand hotels, and suddenly this city of the medieval or of the Baroque becomes a European center. But what is even more notable, and has to be said in this context, is that there's a fundamental change from a feudal society into a bourgeois society. And this is the result of the wealthiness of the economic result of the wealthiness out of industrial revolution. And in this moment, when all this happens, Plečnik is just a couple of years away from entering into the city, which has this really fundamental change. There's a river, I just wanted to show something. You see on the right, on the bottom, the so-called Karlskirche, or Karl's Church, and you see also this, the Vienna secession. I hope I can lead you there. So this is the secession, this is the Karlskirche, and you will see immediately what the fundamental change can be. So it's the idea of the Higdenization of the city itself around 1890, and this is how it works. So it's an intervention that is bringing the river into a kind of regulation, bringing public transport. These are the utilitarian projects of Otto Wagner, to whom we will come in the next step. Another important move is also the Vienna secession, already existing as a building that is trying to reunize design, art and architecture as a message which is far away from that what the city knows at the moment, neo-Baroque, neo-Renaissance, languages which are eclecticistic and on the level of reproduction but not of a creative spirit. I mentioned before the parliament. Theophil Hansen is one of the very big players in the city, responsible for many public buildings. And the parliament is one of it, and he loves everything what is new, from iron to glass. He's working with these new elements, but he never shows them. They disappear behind an eclectic dress. His history is very close to Hellenism, as he is very much occupied by the idea, obsessed by the idea of archaeology. But what he's doing, in fact, and that's the point, he's making a kind of alliance between this kind of architectonic language and democracy, which seems to be close. But the Ringstrasse is full of these things, of Gothic architecture, of Renaissance architecture, always dedicated to a certain function. Maybe an important role in all this, and also for the further steps, is Semper. Semper is the one who tries to get a more fundamental way into the question of style, saying that architecture is its origin very precisely in the shelter and maybe in a, let's say, framework below. And passing from that, he quotes examples from a very simplistic architecture, a very archetypal one, where he is also speaking about the wreckwork of certain tribes, covering this kind of scaffolds, where he's also in the same moment talking about textiles and the different structures and individuality that creates his patterns. So this is then for him the outer skirt, the most important one, as it represents the appearance of a building. Of course, he's dividing between floor, ceiling and walls, but still this kind of skin is for him the main message. With other words, we can say there's a core, there's a shell, or you can say there's a structure and there's an ornament. And by the moment when you just try to sew two things together, you're already in the trap of ornament of an individual way to make this kind of connection. There's something else which is very important, and this starts about around 1890. It's called Eisenbeton. Translated, it's iron beton, and they start to understand how they can really make big spans for uses like theaters below a public house, like big workspaces. So this is now also a very good exhibition I can recommend to you, which is called Eisenbeton in Vienna and currently in the Wien Museum to be seen. It's fantastic. I really can recommend it. The picture is a little robbery out from there. Why I show this has something to do with these gentlemen here. You might know them. Totally on the left, Otto Wagner, who is very much quoting the theories of Semper, but he's still very strongly convinced that architecture is based on construction, the architectonic form is based on construction. And he has a group of collaborators and students around, in the front to the right, Olbrich, and behind him already Plečnik, arriving in Vienna, in a school where he didn't make before a gymnasium, nothing. He had a carpenter education at home in the house of the father, went then to the school in Graz, arrived after 2 years in Vienna, and we are in the year 1898, but he arrives much earlier. And he sees how the changements of this city are really working rapidly and quick. We're talking about 25 years, which had really taken to build up the Ringstrasse. And he is in the middle of it and sees all the technical possibilities this period is offering. You will recognize also in the middle Vabljeni, who was also his assistant, both coming from the cast, playing a very important role later on, also in a very personal relation, which might be known well. People say Plečnik was not studying at Wagner's class, he was studying at Vabljeni. A complicated relation, which I don't want to light out now, but both characters then in the consequence are quite important for the modern architecture of Vienna. Let's return to this image of the first big buildings Wagner is doing on his own. He pays them from his private money or from the money of the family, and it's quite obvious that he's explaining here certain things. The one is a sockel zone dedicated to public use, above offices, then a zone of living, but the main message that he's carrying out already in this building is a kind of painting board. He returns to a kind of blackboard as the idea of the facade, and he says that it needs a certain geometrization in this blackboard to make this kind of skin more readable and clear. There's a certain end on the top with this cantilever which is framing the facade, and this is more or less his entry in the Viennese parquet, and you see quite precisely what this means for the facade. Of course, there's the theory of the skin on it in an ornamental way, but the message is this very clear geometric entry with the cantilever on the top, and this is a theme that is later on much more carried in front by Vabljeni. So it's again this kind of skin that he's making with pyrogranite, which is a product of zunaj, which is a sustainable, resistible material, and he differs this facade also in these three sequences, the sockel zone, then this kind of framed blackboard, and not anymore this cantilever coming out. It's a barrel, half-barrel roof that is connected through a very elegant and light iron fence. And this is just, if we make a jump back, we are in 1897, and we were before in 1898. So you see these things are quite close to each other, and they have quite a dynamic to develop. This is how it looked a couple of years ago, a little bit changed, but this central message of the skin, of the shelter, is transformed into modernity. He's playing with that on another level as well in the Ataria house, fixing with nails, obviously here, as you can see it, marble pieces to the facade, and he makes quite understandable that these elements are fixed. They are not carrying, they are this kind of skin, and we are in the year 1900, 1902, so those two buildings are very close to each other, and the same goes for then later on the building of the Postsparkasse by Otto Wagner. Also this very precise distinction in a horizontal way, and 100,000 of nails fixing in a very talkative way the facade to its ground. Plečnik is more or less upset about that, and he tries to find into a more precise way of fixing this theme of the facade, to regulate this question of modernity, and he does it in his very precise and particular way. The original plans are amazing. They are quite precise on the way of production. You can build it quite easily without BIM, without nothing, and it was for me quite impressive to be around in the archive of Peter Zachal. What is the story before? Zachel is a family that is producing insect powder, and with a certain wealthiness that makes them establish a shop that is looking a little bit Osmanic, Orientalic, which is also referring to their clients, and it's done by two architects called Kraus and Tölk. Now there's a regulation of the building, and you can see here that the former part where the shop also was is cut off, and there's a new shape coming into existence, which is a ground of planning, a planning ground for Plečnik, and this is in fact in the very beginning a competition. Otto Wagner invites him, Schöntal, Tölk and Kraus, who were already making the shop, also Vabljeni, who doesn't really participate, and in the end it's this young guy to win the competition with 28 years. And the impressive thing is that he was running 3 years through the Academy of Fine Arts, having before this education on this very precise handicraft education, and from there on he wins the prix of the Academy. He makes his travel through Europe, he returns to the studio of Wagner, and this is the moment where in fact his career starts. It's a competition which is very much referring to the things that we've seen before. You see the Sockelzone, this kind of fixation that he has seen with Vabljeni. Then you see a slight way also to work with stone, but fixed in a different way. Floral aspects like with Otto Wagner, little circles and a roof that is more than strange. So this project looks in the ground floor plan like this, with a central staircase, with a courtyard giving light to the spaces below where the servants live, and then it falls asleep. Later on it returns on his table, a couple of years later, we're in 1904, and he starts to work out more precisely this facade. The strange roof disappears, balconies come into existence, the stones are in a different way placed on the columns. He tries to form an entrance, but the problem is another one. The problem is the staircase, and he desperately starts to work on the staircase in order not to give away too much space and not to divide the building itself. It's nothing else than if you start to scratch on a black spot on the wall, and as more you do scratch, the more the spot gets obvious. And this is what he's doing, and tries to find all different kinds of tricks how to enter into the building, and in fact turns the staircase into another way to have two courtyards. So he tries to avoid this kind of division of the building, what in the end is quite a result that looks like this. But what's the point? Kraus and Tölk ask Ast, who is one of the big constructors and building companies, to make on the ground floor and on the first floor this kind of Eisenbeton, this kind of reinforced structure, which gives more possibilities to divide the space, to use it, and to have it really as a selling area. As a consequence, he moves out of the structure, the staircase, and gives it quite a particular entrance, which we will see later. But the fact is that he is dividing those two areas. He's not anymore cutting in the middle, and he gives an open surface that you can use. A very modernistic way. The columns are in a distance of 5.2 meters. They are 80 per 90, 90 per 120 in the facade. And this is a point that is for me very important, because this, let's say, regulation or this kind of order is then being continued, or has to be continued in the facade, which will be his next problem. Now you see this ceiling, this staircase has daylight, it's set in the right position, you can divide the floor plans as you like, and in fact this is happening until today. The facade goes still along Otto Wagner, trying to make his master's rectangular, geometric moves, but he's not very successful and happy with it. And of course, the top, the corniche, is the main problem, where he's working on it, sketching on it, and he makes of an element space, inserting windows, inserting then also figures which are supporting the cantilever that will arrive, and you see more precise we go, the more clearly this shape comes through. What we see here is a very precise modulation of a rhythm A, B, running over the whole facade, running over all materials and running over all functional areas. And this is quite a consequent way that is coming out from the concrete, the reinforced concrete structure that he has below. Now, if you look at this picture, it's not really saying that what Plečnik wanted. If you take his photography or the photography he authorized, it's getting quite clear. The socle zone is closed, the glazing is away, he wants to have the weight below, and then he has in the middle this kind of, if you want to, of cover, which is carried in the same extent on the bottom, where he has the offices, let's show it here, and is carried also on the top with this kind of corniche that he is making running around. Of course, the cantilever coming out is carried by bodies of Metzner, we will talk about that later. But there is this horizontal element dividing two areas, another horizontal element dividing again, two stripes which are surrounding this big curtain of stone. Talking about this complicated corner, he never knew how to close this moment and how to make a contact to the neighbor building. And in fact, this is what the colportage says. He took a little box of teeth powder and he put it on the model, and this is what you see today. The spaces up there which go a little bit to the back and make this kind of volumetric experience have secondary uses. And if we look at the facade today, something is getting quite interesting. He's using granite. And granite is not the material that you normally use on a facade for nothing. It's a material that you use in graveyards. It's a material that you use on terraces, but it's not something you use on the facade. He takes it, and for a very simple reason that you can probably see in the next pictures, he's forming this kind of skin, which is also giving a big effect of reflection. Granite has this possibility and makes this kind of curtain nearly disappear. Another point is that he distacks himself from the other building with a neutral zone on his plot in order to make visible that this curtain is really existing, like an element set in front of the facade. He's also consequently going into the corner. The elements that you see here are by an artist called Metzner, and they are made out of artificial, Steingut, stoneware. In fact, that's what it is. So this is also the capacity that he has, is to use or to reinterpret materials into another context. This is a big art that you always will find in his work, and just going around the corner you understand the plasticity that he's working in by a very simple fact. Not only by these guys carrying the cantilever, but by something completely different as well. He has these slabs of granite, and the granite slabs are in their seams covered by a molding, and the molding is also the fixation, so he goes completely away from this discussion that is done by Wagner, that is done by Vabljeni. In this case, he's very close to the Portois and Fix building, but he just makes it very clear that this is a topographic situation coming out from functional uses. He gives on that a kind of profundity, a topography. He's having this kind of ABA modulation in it that runs to the windows. The windows get also another kind of plasticity. In the middle you can open them in order to bring air in. So every little detail is quite reflected and done, and not so much loaded up by a lyric or pathetic step. So this is the facade. And if you go into the city and you see this element in the different forms of daylight, you will see what the high quality of reflection and topographical experience this building can offer. Now, I was speaking about this main construction that is carrying the building as well as the skin, but I didn't speak yet about this very representative part of the staircase. So he brings you in and makes you immediately stop. You have to climb up on this level of distribution. You see in the back the light with the staircase going up, and he plays very gently with the idea of a polished material, of an absorbing material, of different light situations. And out of these differentiations, our perception has, of course, much more spatial profundity that is very much requested in this, let's say, aside situation. He brings you up to this quite well-known staircase, stopping you, giving you always different speeds on walking, on reception, and brings you into this very elegant staircase. You never have the idea of going up, you have more the idea of flying up. This little quotation is an insect. I think this is not much to be explained. And going up, you have this illumination that he is gaining from the free position of the staircase. He's doing also something different that I appreciate very much. He's using, again, a simple material. It's wood that you use normally in this way for flooring, and he's changing again the dedication of the material into another context. It looks poor, but it's not poor at all. It gives this kind of tenderness to the staircase as a contradiction to the stone slabs which form the stairs. Now, this relation between facade, which I was explaining so deeply, is for me in this case quite interesting because he's entering into another project called Heilige Geistkirche, which is in the poorest area that Vienna has to offer, inhabited by about 25,000 people in the 15th district. And he has a little plot where Zachel brings him as well in position because they are connected also through the religion. Zachel is a very religious person working in different religious circles and has the big intention to bring into this workers' district a church. Zachel makes the proposal to bring into this planning process Plečnik. It's a very little plot, very narrow, and they want to make social housing and some other social institutions around, so there's not much space left for the church itself. This is already a later step, but I try to show you how he's working on this narrowness. So he's not afraid to use reinforced concrete as long as it gives him back a big form, and he understands the quality that is inscribed in these possibilities. And you see in this drawing, if you take the lyric sequences, the religious one away, it could be a proper modern building of the present. He's also trying to get control of this very narrow space in a former drawing where he's making these arches out of concrete, binding the altar to the entrance. So there are hundreds of maneuvers that are contained in the final plan as you see it. And this plan is never realized. The whole project is a relation between hope and desperate seek of money. And the project gets always more simple and more simple and more simple. So the Heiligen Geistkirche doesn't have the Campanile, it doesn't have the social housing, it doesn't have granite columns, it doesn't have really bricks in the back, it doesn't have this rich game of materials that he wanted. It's one material. So we're not talking anymore about core and shell, about the skin and the construction. It's a monolithic appearance, which is now a complete different discussion than the one that we had just before. Now, looking at the facade these days, this is how it was a couple of days ago. You see the concrete structure, the two wings that still try to express some kind of bigger body that was not realized. It's also the profundity in the facade that he's playing perfectly. If you see at the drawing that he had originally had on this part, you can imagine the consequence of the material used that would have been different. So all this richness is gone. There is no campanile, there's a little bell tower which has a relation to the cast. Now that's the way of making a church in concrete, but it has a complete different connotation again if we go into the inside. The deepness, let's say topographic appearance of the facade is again played elegantly also in this material of abstraction. Now let's return to the inside. We see these columns. They are always form, and they form, let's say, a quite fundamental situation, and they are connected, as you can see here, by a framework. So what he's doing, to return to the ground floor again, with these two frameworks, with these two bridges, he's forming a kind of basilica type, divided in three parts. And it's this monolithic construction that he's using without hesitation in order to create a big space. Boris Podreka called it, of course, La Piazza, and it's a space that is really disponible. But what's interesting for me was the fact that he is working in this monolithic material, but also giving this kind of modulation in it, he's giving this kind of order in it, he's giving this kind of structure, not only in a static sense, also in a formal sense. So this is getting one thing that is really glued to each other. This is the authentic photography of the period, and as you can see on these 2 points, and this is why I show you that, this is concrete, this is something different, this might be treated. The altar is put completely into the back in order to have a kind of shady situation, a mystic situation for the decoration of this place. Now, a couple of days ago, this changed. The church had a fire accident, it's restored, it became white, not to my pleasure, because it's not making very clear what the church used to be and what the structural idea behind is. But what you still can see very precisely are these two huge bridges of 24 meters span, which are giving a place to this area. And these images, for me, this inlay in Plečnik's work as a constructive modernist, which is also to be considered, and which is here played in a completely convincing way. And I think it's one of the very rare examples, long before Perret worked on these spans and worked on these situations in a religious, let's say, space or in a church. Also here he plays the game of looking from the dimmed situation into the illuminated one, also to make your perception sharp again. And I was completely fascinated when I stepped into this church for the first time. A span that is also giving the possibility of light to enter, and this was more than convincing. There's something else that is dedicated to the slope of the area. Maybe yes, this is something which makes me a little bit think. The inside white is suddenly on the outside as well, as seen some days ago. I don't know what the plan is behind it, but it doesn't really represent Plečnik's simplification of this very reduced, economically reduced, but not architectonically reduced project. The crypta. Here he tries to work with elegance and lightness to support a space which is not showing you the heaviness that might be above. There is no heaviness. There are the bridges. And this is how the space looked like. When the money still was lacking, you had a little cross in it. And then you see this kind of classic quotation that he does in the capitals, in the bases, but always on this level of abstraction. Hammered beton against plain surface, never realized paintings. So it's an unfinished one, which is also the last project he does in Vienna before he's really settling his workplace to Prague. When you come down, you have this impression of this crypta, which is also playing with these different surfaces and light situations. Later on, I think it was in the 80s, Boris Podreka was taking care of the restoration and the illumination of this place together with Bartenbach, and you suddenly get an idea of the lightness of this construction, which is then on the double height, giving again daylight from the main altar into the inside. So this is always for me a surprise to go in there, to think about Perret, and to know that this happens much, much earlier. Yes, so this way into the technical world interested me very much as a constructing architect, and these were the qualities that behind many others I identified the most and I wanted to show you, seen in this huge development of the city in a short period where Plečnik reacts very precisely on the possibilities that he has and on the idea of modernism, which he's carrying on in a very particular way, which could be another discourse, but I think we're at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andras, for speaking so directly and honestly about design. And we are privileged to hear these things from such a good designer as yourself. And I have to mention that you have recently successfully finished a huge renovation of Austrian Parliament, which is a major player within Vienna and also takes place within the Green Ring of Vienna. So congratulations on that project, and thank you very much for your participation. So we are going to have a 10 minutes break, just to kind of put a little bit of air in the space and for you to, kind of chill out a little bit. And then we are continuing with, I hope, short and concise discussion that Vit is going to moderate with the speakers of today. Let's see if we can bring Georgia now when technology works, and thank you very much for making that happen. And see you in 10.
Maybe just a very quick introduction. My name is Vit. I co-run AA Visiting School Nanotourism. And maybe just to start by saying what an amazing afternoon of lectures. And to thank everyone who participated and brought your what we call the views from outside. And I think this is something that we sort of wanted to explore this year and really question what are we missing and what don't we see because we're standing too close to it. So maybe that's the first prompt potentially for all three speakers that we have here. Is there anything obvious or apparent that you would say that this sort of dominant discourse about Plečnik that has largely been generated by a certain generation in certain time is missing? And maybe, Axel, I would put you on the spot, since, as Alyosha said, you're the representative of the youngest generation of researchers. What is it that, draws you to Plečnik over and over again?
I think that when I discovered Plečnik, it was very easy for me to fall into the myth, because the generations who talk about him, I think they were like a interpretation of the myth, and so I have to say that even at the time it was easily because of the bibliographical elements to fall into this myth, and it's just recently that I just questioned myself about this question of myth, and for me we have to be aware and we have to be careful about how we speak about architects, how we speak about movements, and also I think we have to be aware of this thing when we try to produce scientific content and roundtables and everything, because it's always very easy to maintain myth around certain things. So this is why I begin to work on these subjects in particular, but maybe you want to add something?
For me, it's every now and then not the constant confrontation and interest with Plečnik. I think he's somebody whom you always have on your schermo, on your shield. But in particular, what interests me always is a certain quality of architecture, and there's, for God's sake, enough of it. So every now and then you can change, and this is something what I like to do. But Plečnik definitely in front of the house door is a different topic that I appreciate very much. So it's not something you forget, it's something you carry along with you.
Well, I wanted to give a cue to Georgia, who is still with us. So that's amazing. Thank you. I was surprised, intrigued by your closing remark in your presentation, speaking about resiliency of Plečnik work. So that's something that we haven't really discussed in all of the discussions as far as my knowledge goes. And of course, it is a simple answer to say, you know, he was really careful about the materiality, so he built in truth. But there are also other things, which is this, well, what Tomáš Toka and the team has kind of concluded in the UNESCO application that human-centered design is something, but this social responsibility towards the user of the city. And last year's symposium, Petra Čeferin was speaking about Plečnik's work asking for an active user. And this is the only way how Plečnik work works. So I think this social component and the fact that we are still speaking today and that Axel is interested into it, I think that's a super interesting topic of how architecture can become resilient today, like Plečnik's interventions were from back then till now and in the future. So Georgia.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, we are still talking about Plečnik. One would think that by now it would be totally absorbed, a topic, etc. But I think I've been also following various discussions in the Slovenian literature and publicity, etc. I think what's interesting about Plečnik's resilience is that we value certain things in his work, and therefore we have an emotional attachment, and therefore it also shows that it can bounce back from any major disasters, etc. But at the same time, and this is why I try to kind of talk about it a little bit, is would be interesting to see how ordinary people in the city, particularly children, and I know you have done some work with children in Gradaščica River, is their understanding of the place, the concept of place and space, and what does it mean to them, without necessarily knowing, oh, it's Jože Plecnik who did that, etc. But the resilience comes from something that becomes adopted by all of us as users, and therefore we would continue to use it because it's so important to us, etc. And I think this aspect of resilience and people perception, ordinary residents, etc., rather than high academia or critics, is something that I haven't seen much, except, you know, we have done this work on urban memory, which was more about a place rather than Plečnik. But there are some coincidences. And I think, particularly when you run your workshop in Ljubljana in the next few days, it would be interesting to get these voices from the users, be it elderly, be it children, traders, for example, how do they use and understand the market, etc., so that we can see this resilience and longevity from different perspectives.
I think this is a really interesting point of resilience, but also, to an extent, ambiguity of Plečnik's work, a work that lends itself to be appropriated in many ways. Yeah. And it has this sort of, and I'm wondering if Luca maybe wants to expand on this a bit, this sort of abstract nature, you know, that it's so easy to project something onto. What does a pyramid mean? What does the sphere all of a sudden mean? You know, in a similar fashion that you sort of ran us through this excursion that conveniently led us to Plečnik as well.
So I would just mention, just mention the things of the resilience. I'm a very boring architectural historian, so I'm not really the right guy to ask this, because it's very difficult to apply modern problems on history. No? This is a speculative hit which architects have to do, but we as historians never do, because this is just to answer to the thing that from the exhibition in Pompidou till today, every year there is a symposium more or less of Plečnik, and we can continue on and on to project on Plečnik contemporary issues. No? I think that there are no, you can count 10 architects of the 20th century, you can do the same thing today. No? So, Le Corbusier, and we can go on and on and on, and Mies and Beau and Duiker probably, and so on. But it's really something peculiar of this figure. Going back to what you asked me, in my opinion, this is as an answer as an architectural historian, not as, in my opinion, he is extremely interesting because his conceptual dimension is incredibly strong, which he never wrote, apart from the letters, of course, but we don't have the testimony of his incredible conceptual, but he has it. In my opinion, it's enough to go in his home and see the library, no? The books, the journals that he possessed even more, and he read even more, in which you can totally understand that his horizon was contemporaneity on one side, extremely, he was following in the journals from Vienna, of course, London, and classicism, which is not the classicism of the, let's say, the continuity of the classicism of neoclassic type, boring, repeating, but Giulio Romano, Ledoux, Piranesi, no? So the continuity of how specific, all the Baroque for Borromini, they were breaking totally the idea of classicism as a dogma, using it but breaking constantly. This is, in my opinion, he's a kind of person who conceptually uses classicism but kills it every day. He is part of it, but he's incredibly modern in interpreting it, and not only in language, but in architectural space, in construction. This is, in my opinion, his most striking thing, no? That he is conceptually, theoretically, far than we can grasp. Because time after time, next year, in 2-3 years, when the question will be, I don't know which kind of issue, contemporary, we will see in Plečnik the same things.
I think this is a really interesting point, and I think Andras kind of touched on that in many different ways, in this sort of dichotomy between the two, where Plečnik kind of sat. And I think there's some kind of discourse on materiality there as well. And I think, Andras, you opened this up with granite as a facade material, but it seems that it goes beyond that in Plečnik all the time. So I was kind of wondering if we could maybe expand on that a bit. You know, the notion of materiality in Plečnik's work seems to be also amid this, you know, ecological crisis, all the like polycrises that we live in, seems to all of a sudden become extremely contemporary again.
I think there's something in his biography that is overseen mostly, and it's his first 6 years where he was having his education, working in the carpenter shop of the father, really getting a tough education later on in Graz, working in a firm that was delivering in the whole monarchy high quality furniture. He designed it, he worked on it. He was then transformed to Vienna to do the same in a more known firm. So he went through all these stages with a very handicrafted experience. And in the same sense, he had a very high graphic experience. So those two things matched very well. When he went to Vienna, he tried to make the exam, the entry exam at the Academy of Applied Art. He was rejected, which was a big shock, and which then was compensated in a huge effort of work. So all the other students he was working with in the class of Wagner said they can't even speak with him because he's living this kind of monastic life. And this is, I think, the compensation also of that, what he couldn't achieve in the beginning. So these two, let's say, aspects are running through his life. And it's a kind of, yes, autodidact career on the one hand, and then, of course, the very intellectual education in the class of Otto Wagner. So this is the fundament, and this is the source, I think, where he always took his basic energy from, giving different modulations to the theme. But his, let's say, his knowledge how to build things, to put it that way, how to construct them, what material is his big gift, which others didn't have. So he was always able to change the dedication of a material in complete another one with a complete different aesthetic approach. So I think this game is something you can find then later on, also now 10, 15 years ago, with other architects that are working on the same method. And he was brilliant in that. But this is all based on his handicraft experience and his understanding of material. And out of that, he was able to transform it in every scale. And this was his big, let's say, quality. That's the way I see it. If you want to reduce it on the surface material, this is something which makes very understandable what his type of education was. So he had never a gymnasium, he had never an academic career. The only thing that he had was he entered in the class of Otto Wagner, and after 3 years he was not only inside there, he was a respected planner where Lowe's immediately wrote him the first positive article. So this is something very autodidactic in his career. This is how I see it.
I'm really enjoying how tonight we've met all these Plečniks. You know, this 28-year-old young dude in a Otto Wagner studio, the Plečnik who understands material, Plečnik who moves through sequences of Ljubljanica, Plečnik who is this proto-land art artist, if you like, right? And I think this, if we just remain at the notion of appropriation, who appropriates Plečnik, I think then becomes also an interesting question. I think Axel did this quite a really impressive body of work of how Plečnik can then be appropriated through all these different perspectives, you know? At one moment, he's absolute classicist, but at the next one, he becomes a vehicle for postmodern movement. So Axel, I'm wondering if you want to maybe expand a bit on, you know, on your journey through the archive and this sort of, you know, all these different clashing things that probably you encountered through that.
Okay. No, it's just that. So when I discovered Plečnik, it was there were a lot of discussions about styles and labels and is it postmodern, is it modern, is it classicist? And in fact, to be honest, when I proposed you this lecture, I was not sure about what I was going to find in the archive, and it was for me interesting to find that it was not always a question of modernism and postmodernism, but that in each countries and each press articles there were a lot of different interpretations, and unfortunately it was always about is it close to Vabljeni, is it close to Gaudi, is it close to Louis Sullivan, is it close to postmodernism, and it's a bit weird for me because even in the catalogue of the exhibition I think that François Burkhardt was very clear about the fact that it was not a question of styles, but it was a question of a very rigorous style and a very rigorous work, and everything. But even with the exhibition, even with the catalogue, the question about Plečnik was always a question of styles. I mean, like, when I mean always, it's just for, I think, international review. And even when I began to work on Plečnik, when I searched for roundtables, conferences and everything, there is always this question of label and this question of which style. And I don't, maybe this is easier for human people to put a label on something, but it was, for me, it was often like we just speak about style and label and we don't speak about the real work behind. And I think this is something that it's not only about Plečnik, it's about a lot of other architects, it's about women, it's about a lot of other things. The fact is just that I work on Plečnik, so it was a subject. But I think this is this is something we have to be careful with. And
I think this is something that also Jožeta was alluding to in her talk, sort of speaking about unique experience of Ljubljana, right? It's not necessarily where it falls within the tradition of other experiences. It's just an experience in its own right. And I think, Jožeta, you sort of also then touched on all these elements that Plečnik is playing with in order to curate that unique experience. So I'm kind of wondering if you have anything to add to what Axel just raised.
Yeah, it's interesting what Axel was saying, because when I started to be researching Plečnik, there was in Slovenia at the time not very positive attitude towards his work, because local, largely, I think, art historian critics were looking at different kind of architecture and different kind of story, and then suddenly, when the interest from abroad started to appear and people started to go into the architectural museum to look at the drawings, etc., and there was then a conference in Ljubljana, suddenly the interest became varied. So we had different perspectives that Axel was talking about in terms of, whether he was postmodernist, it was coinciding with the postmodernist ideas at the time, or whether he was something else. But for me, it was always very much that I try to understand from my own personal experience, what does it mean to me as both an academic, but also as a user. And this is where I think the richness of his work is, that whichever perspective we take, whether it's a high academic debate or whether it's ordinary debate about Ljubljana and its spaces, etc., it intrigues us. It gives us still these kind of opportunities to be exploring it in a different way. And this is where I think the value is. We can have different perspectives, we can see the value of his material culture, value of this, etc. But as a user of the city, this is to me whether it's interior space of a church, or whether it's how that building fits in the space, in the city, or whether it's the sequence or whatever, it all gives us different meanings. And therefore we can construct our own values about the work of Plečnik. And I think this is where the richness is. It's good to have different perspectives.
And I think this, there's something very valuable also in the way some of the last year's projects of nanotourism that Alyosha was presenting were conducted, is through this sort of rigorous approach of, going to these spaces, testing out, speaking to people. And I think for me, a bit of a reflection on last year is also that there seems to be a large amount of humor hidden somewhere there, both in terms of how people interact with some things that in many ways can be perceived very classical, but also in terms of how Plečnik seems to embody some of this humor himself as a designer. So I was wondering, Alyosha, if you want to speak maybe more about, your reflection on how these outside perspectives maybe showed, well, you and me as well, but I'm asking you now, what are we missing? What's there? Is there something really humorous about Plečnik's work that maybe we missed?
Well, I don't want to expand too much because I'm more interested in your opinions on the same question. But at the end, each of us has to interpret that humor for ourselves. So again, I'm very much subscribing under the user value of the understanding Plečnik and how it really works in Ljubljana, that these two things are very much connected. No? So, would like to hear maybe from historical point of view of the projects that you have seen, and humor.
Humor and history. But I think that in general the architecture of Plečnik is didactic, no? In some kind of way teaches many different things. And one of the things which let's say, he teaches how to look into architecture, no? What architecture is used for, what kind of role has to have. No? It's somehow inherent in itself. And I am following what you said before, which I think is fundamental, no? That one of those lectures that it's impossible to overestimate, which is Vienna, that he learned in Vienna this aspect, no? The capacity of keeping, let's call it an architecture with a big A, together with the naivety, with the architecture from beneath, if you want, no? From below, sorry, from below, no? Which is something that came from that city and from that culture that formed him. So each time that he has humor, he has this kind of things that come from different environments of the architectural culture, if you want. A culture that is totally not, let's say, the official academic one, and the peasant one. They have the same importance. They have the same status, no, in this architecture. And this is, I think, freedom. In this sense also, I don't know if humor is the right word, but this openness, no, to the capacity of, I can learn from everybody, and I want you to also to learn from me. No, this is.
Just to add, I think humor in architecture is very problematic. Because jokes maybe in that way that you can laugh once, twice, but not 3 times. And this is a category that I wouldn't like to inscribe there. But to go on to that, what you mentioned before, what I appreciate very much, that he never wrote. We know his personal letters, but there is no statement that he did. So there's nothing, but there's something where he has this Christian social aspect. There's this kind of Christian mysticism. Then he's talking about Slavinismus. Then there's so many different roles that make the person even more hermetic the more they become. And this is why you can't really find the key to understand it. This is my problem. So there are many different tracks in his work, which in the end make a very clear picture, but that is isolated one for the other is hard to really settle or to understand in his whole work, as there's no writing, there's a really hermetic mess is the stupid word. There's just too much that you hardly really can organize in a really precise picture. He's pulling himself, I think, with a quite smart strategy out of this discussion. This is my impression. It's a very unscientific, constructor's point of view.
And I think this sort of hermetic nature of his work then lends itself to be projected onto, right? And I guess this is why, as Luca says, we can keep talking about it over and over again. I'm conscious of how little time we have today left, so I'm wondering if we open it up maybe to the public quickly, and then we see if we want to dwell on any of the questions a bit further. So, Tomasz will pass on the mic if, yes, questions.
Thank you very much for your words. I had a question for Luca in particular, and I guess I'm going to be kind of black and white here for the sake of the clarity of the question. But I guess, from my understanding, as you say, if we classify land art in the US as kind of representational, it stops at the concept of experience, and then monuments in Yugoslavia as didactic operations that kind of hinge on memory. I was wondering if you could speak more about kind of the through line between these, or to get to Plečnik's own urban interventions, or maybe if we use George's kind of definition or classification of them, their ability to create urban memories. So I guess I'm kind of asking about how you would categorize them, classify them in the same way that you kind of used in these two other examples.
Okay, I don't know if I really understand the question, but I will, please interrupt me if I don't. Actually, here in this classroom, there are many people that worked very much, and also in this continuity of contemporary Slovenian architecture, there is much of the teaching of Plečnik in this, if I understood, the relational space with history, no, with tradition, let's say, with the architectural tradition. This is exactly what we were talking before. This is one of his greatest topic, no, to have one of the most important topics of his architecture is this relational aspect with history. And this is, for the 1920s and 30s, a very peculiar thing. I mean, in European architecture, not many architects really do that. Or we can, I mean, you cannot call all the great architects of modern architecture as architects who relate spatially with tradition. Tradition is a very complex thing, but in the most abstract with tradition. This is very rare. Again, Vienna. This comes exactly from the pictures that you showed, no, with the devastation of Vienna, where the young Plečnik is on Wagner's tables, drawing, and is looking to all this incredible architecture that is raising up without any reference with the historical city. And started to be a great polemic in Vienna about the thing that the parliament, Neo-Greek, then the Rathaus, which is Neo-Gothic, that do not have spatial relation. You have books, articles, journals, no, on this. And he raised up with this polemic. And of course, in the moment when he comes here, where he is called, let's say, ethnically and politically, to do architecture of the new formed Yugoslavia, Slovenia, this is an extremely complex thing, is addressed toward, and this has not only an architectural, but also a political message, a cultural message, which becomes incredibly important for his architecture. He's more oriented towards tradition and history in Ljubljana than in Vienna.
Thank you.
Hello, thanks very much for the presentations. I want to ask a question relating to a certain theme that is floating somewhere in the air, but it doesn't seem to be directly addressed, but I think it's a very important and necessary one. So I wanted to start talking about the market specifically, which was presented as this diverse and somehow flexible realm serving both as a place of commerce and as a platform of civic public life. However, sort of experiencing that space and speaking with some of Ljubljana's residents, that perspective is somehow put into question. The reason behind that is that there is this clear occupation of the city center by the mass tourism that seems to seasonally, during the tourist high season, transform the market from a place of both commerce and civic life into a place of a near total commerce. And obviously, impact of Plečnik's work is immense, and he's very much alive and dynamic in creating subsequent generations of innovative architects and thinkers. So I suppose, although Plečnik as an attitude of spatial thinking prevails, it can be claimed that elements of his work become maybe not obsolete, I think that this is too hard of a word, but they become consumed by forces of globalization and neoliberalism. And I wanted to ask, how should we see this problem? Because apparently it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So I want to ask if Ljubljana is this perfect city that will actually outlive capitalism. And that should should be preserved at all cost? Or should we entertain the idea that Plečnik Ljubljana needs to change in some form to address new reality of the world that wasn't part of the picture when Plečnik was alive? And if so, how to do that? So yeah, I suppose I'm just trying to imagine if Plečnik was alive right now, how would he think about urbanism that is facing all these global problems? Especially like mass tourism and immigration.
I'm wondering, Georgia, if you want, sorry to throw you under the bus here, but since you can expand on this morphological, research into it, is there something post-capitalist, any potential for, let's say, revolution to emerge in that sort of open framework that Plečnik sets up?
I think it's the responsibility of particularly the people who manage and govern the city of Ljubljana to decide how to balance the money that they get from mass tourism against other criteria, such as particularly in terms of protecting local residences, etc. And if we look, for example, at the South Bank in London, and from the Tate Modern going all the way to Coin Street development, it's an interesting example whereby local residents take charge of some of the aspects of the management of space in order to neutralize some of the impacts of global tourism, and therefore they can exhibit their work, they can have their markets, etc. So it's a matter, again, giving more power probably to local traders, local people, etc., to balance how the local needs of the residents could be counterbalanced with mass tourism. But I have come across various projects in Australia where they had a similar problem, and what they've done there is they almost organized a kind of capacity building for tourism. The same happened in Prague when Charles Bridge was falling down because of mass tourism. And they introduced the ticketing number, so many buses can enter with tourists, etc. So it's managing global tourism and other pressures that I think we need to consider in the local circumstances. So it's difficult sometimes to balance the economic benefit against the other benefits. And I think this is something that locally could be explored.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. Are there any other questions from the public, potentially? Or any responses? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering throughout the presentation today, which I really enjoyed, so thank you, but why, I'm fairly new to the concept of Plečnik's architecture, and I was wondering for a while today why, given how willing he was to accept innovation and materiality and use materials in new ways, why he was kind of holding on to references to classicism, and I think your talk shed some light onto that. But at the same time, I've also been wondering whether this kind of juxtaposition between the kind of innovation and materiality compared to architectural form might create a sense of kind of uncanny that he was potentially trying to invoke, and your thoughts on comedy just now made me wonder whether it's more about uncanniness than comedy, and whether the kind of the familiarity that you were speaking about earlier, that he was trying to create a sense of comfort amongst the local populations of Ljubljana, could be kind of countered by this sense of unhomeliness and unfamiliarity out of the kind of improper use of proportion and substitution of classical capitals with lamps and so on. And at the same time, is a pyramid, is the strength of a pyramid there to protect me, or is it there to threaten me? And is that intrigue a success of Plečnik's? And at the same time, perhaps is that kind of ambiguity and allowing the kind of observer to overlay their own interpretation, is that also kind of today a cause, one of the causes of this kind of mass tourism that we're seeing, and people come to Ljubljana just to see these objects without really needing to understand the true history to kind of find an intrigue in them.
Since we dived into a bit of Freud here, I'm looking into Viennese representative. Andras, would you like to expand on?
I will pass the question then to him, because what concerns now the urban layout, I mean, a city is not something that comes into existence from one day to the other. This is very clear. It's a growing structure, and I think the big quality to talk again about Plečnik is really to find the right balance points in this texture. And this is really something which is giving a value to a certain place, gives an orientation, so it has many levels how it could be read. But it's more or less always a balance point independent from its size. So I think this is something that the city can digest, have, not have. So this is something what we call, let's put it that way, to understand differences is also the base of a development. And I think what he did here is quite outstanding and will resist. So it's something sustainable from another point of view, from an urban point of view. But to get more to the Freudian question and more to that what we were speaking about before, I would like to pass a question to the historian, because there's somebody about whom we didn't speak so much, but he's one of, from my point of view, one of the big reference points for Plečnik, and he's called Semper. And how would you see the role of Semper? Because he didn't write the third book, I know this is the problem, but on the way to it, he's always referring to Semper in different ways. I mean, he's calling his students the students of fire, which is coming from the big master Semper, as he says, the first architecture is to dig a hole to have the earth around and the fire in the middle, and so on and on. So we are again in these mystic romanticisms of the 19th century. But what role, from your point of view, really is Semper for Plečnik?
Mamma mia. No, grazie. It is a marvelous, let's say, push toward a topic which is great, again, thing that comes from Vienna. This is a fundamental book for all architects that that formed themselves in the end of the 19th century, starting the 20th century, were all formed with those 10 books, 15 books, and one of the capital books was, of course, Der Stil by Semper. But, yeah, and I think that every architecture of Plečnik can be read through the conceptualization of the architectural elements that Semper stated in his infinite number of pages, drawings, illustrations, explaining the teleologia, si chiama, genealogy, no, of the architectural form since prehistoric time till today, how the architectural elements change this through the materiality, blah, blah, blah. And he uses it constantly. I will add just one thing. Semper was an architect who built very much and was the first great modern theorist of architecture. And he saw Crystal Palace. Now I will tell you why. He was working in the Crystal Palace, 1851, this probably the first modern architecture ever built, no? The Crystal Palace in London during the first international exhibition. Semper is there because he participated in the revolution in Dresden, lost, escaped in London, had marks on his... You will understand why I'm telling all this. And Semper sees the Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace is what? Iron, wrought iron, no? And glass. And he's totally shocked, no? Seeing that these two new materials arrived and the architecture do not participate in this innovation. Why? Because the architect, let's say, not architect, but the guy that realized the Crystal Palace was Joseph Paxton. Joseph Paxton was a designer of greenhouses. The greenhouse is the place where you could grow vegetables in the center of London in the Victorian years. No, it was kind of highly bourgeois thing that you can have lemon in this one. And Semper was, and he understood one thing, is that, and I'm coming to this thing, that innovation in architecture is not coming from the material, not even in the technology, but in the way how you use it. So when we use the term innovation, you use it a couple of times, no? and I'm connecting. The innovation is not something, let's say, high-tech architecture. The capacity to keep the technology of today in our architecture, and especially in our rhetoric of architecture. So, Plečnik, now if we come to, in my opinion, if you ask how innovative is his architecture, is absolutely not in the technological, but in the Zemperian way, how you use. So, in the moment when you enter in the NUK, National Library, you see stone, you see wood, timber, and you see reinforced concrete. He's designing with those three in a completely free way, using sometimes concrete as you use wood, using wood sometimes as you this freedom, no? In my old professor Tafuri called this sprezzatura, no? Capacity of use the product of the contemporaneity, which we think that everything is iPhone and innovative, and you transform it conceptually into something. And there, no, comes, no, the act of architecture, no, becomes the architecture with a big A, no, not the capacity of using the hyper new technology. This is, of course, I'm an architecture historian, and in this sense, I am very traditional, yeah, yes. Yes, metabolic, yeah. I will also would like to say something very unpolitical. Please cut this. Tourism. Very, very unpolitical. Don't, please. I come from Croatia. We had the war, 91, 95, and so on, and I lived. But the damage made by tourism in Dubrovnik, Mostar, Sarajevo, etc., is infinitely more than the damage made by the war. And we cannot help it. We cannot fight against this thing. We have to just hope that one day the kerosene will cost so much money that nobody will travel. But we cannot fight the capitalism. Scusate.
Yeah. Just to add something, I think it's a bit hard or a bit easy to think that the architects can change such things that politics, like capitalism or something. I think that we underestimate maybe the role of architects. We in fact have less and less power about what we draw, and I think that if you want to talk about the end of capitalism, we are in the fight and we have to fight. But this is, I think, it has to be a collective thing, and we don't need and we don't have to think that we can do things alone as architects.
I think we have another question there from the public, and then we'll start wrapping up.
There was this question about Semper. Yeah, of course, it was something. Some people say that it was Otto Wagner who put the Semper on the pedestal because they were teaching about Semper all the time. And if you closely look at the architecture of Jože Plecnik, you will always see some kind of signs about Semper. In Prague, you know, there's a fountain where there is it's written Semper. Then you have the small pyramid in Vegova, no, not in Vegova, but in Sojzova, which is the same situation. There's a wall and there's a pyramid, the same as at the graveyard in Rome where Semper is buried, and so on and so on. Many such details. Or, for instance, how the column on the library, these two big columns, how they are made, you know, because they are like a ionic column with a kind of iron, insert, which is according to the Semper how the Ionic column started, and so on. But I really, so there is, of course, a lot, and he was using these things, but a little, I would say, a little differently, because up to now there has been so many things written about Semper, but there are some people like me also that all these interpretations are a little wrong, so that, but I will not go here to the detail, but I would like to say two things which I think are a little overlooked, but could explain a lot of Plečnik's work and his approach. The first thing Andras said with this picture of the Otto Wagner's atelier, and there was the Max Fabiani. And Max Fabiani was assistant of Wagner, and we all believe that it was really the guy who was trying to teach Plečnik something was Fabiani. Wagner was not very talkative to the students, and he was not really doing things with the students, but Fabiani did. And when later in his years they said, what do you think about Plečnik? And Fabiani said, you could not learn him anything, because he was always, he believed that he must, everything he must do it by himself, to study again, and in his approaches also to his students, he always said, when you stop, you come to the finish of a project, throw it away and start again. It is like he believed that when you finish the first time, you only know the problem, and only the second time and the third time you can really go advance in your ideas. And we have also seen today, for instance, the first projects of Zachar House. What a big difference was it if the first project would be built, it would be unimportant, I would say. Only, the last project was really good. The same with all his prominent projects, like the National Library. We had several, these kind of versions, and when they said, okay, now we will build it, there was a very happy moment that in the Yugoslavia they changed the format of and introduced the Deutsche Industrienorm. So the whole project had to be redesigned, because to do in the module of the brick, not in the Austro-Hungarian brick, but this so-called Deutsche brick, which is also now. So this was a happy moment for him, so he could design again, and change the staircase and so on. And we have even one in Ponikve. There's a church where Plečnik also designed this. After the war, it was destroyed by the German army. And he sent the plans, and they built the church. And then he said, yo, I have another plan. So even when the church was already built, he built what he thought it would be better. So this was kind of a repetition, and he must always, everything he must invent by himself. The second thing, which is completely more or less overlooked, is that when he came to Ljubljana in the early 20s, the students were very happy, and they believed we are there's coming a professor which is from Wagner's Schule, the most advanced modern school and things like that. And then Plečnik came, and it was total disaster for them, because he said, draw me a vase, antique vase, and things like that. And they were very disappointed with this. How it is possible? How it's possible that somebody who was in the center of the modern architecture came to Ljubljana and be so, let's say, classical? And there is a thing which I said is overlooked, and that, for instance, Plečnik was working in Vienna till 1911, and then he was invited to come to Prague. He had some smaller work and Zacharel Chapel and so on in Vienna still to do, but in reality not a lot of work from 1911, and he started really with his production only about 10 years later, after the First World War, which was when he became professor in Ljubljana and so on, and started to work on Hradčany. And this is 10 years when he was 39 to 49 years old. So it means the whole 40 years, which are the most, let's say, powerful or fruitful years, you know, for an architect, you know, 40 years, you know. And in this time, of course, this was this army war, the first war, the big war, it was called, and also the school was, in Prague was closed. So for 10 years, he had the time to rethink what it is going on, you know, and it was a huge shock for the whole Europe, because they had a peaceful time for too many years, and nobody believed how many people will fall in this war, what a tragedy it will come out of it. And when the school was closed, Plečnik went to the hospitals to visit his students, which were wounded there. Some were without legs and arms and so on. Some people died, you know. And it was such a tragedy. And he was thinking who we are, what is our purpose on the planet. I think he thought that he must rethink the whole thing, what it is all about. And when the war stopped, it was already during the war, it was clear that who won, you know, the winner was the new technology, especially the submarine, the airplane, and the tank. And he was not the only one in Europe, or especially in Vienna, who didn't believe in this. And you just remember Josef Frank's book, you know, Architecture and Symbol, and things like that, that this technology, which the modernists, or Corbusier, for instance, took as a style, you know, it's not enough. So he believed that there must be something more, you know, there must be some kind of idea, there must be some kind of symbolism in the whole thing. And he came back to the point when he said, well, how do we know when the Homo sapiens arrived, you know, in the world? And he said, this was the first who was thinking, and he asked himself, what I'm doing on this world, why I do die, you know, and what comes after my death. And we know today, or scientists believe, you know, that the sign of the first Homo sapiens is the graveyard. So when people are thinking that what will come after us, we bury our relatives in the graveyard, and we do a memorial, you know, or a monument or whatever. And there is this kind of a proverb, I think it's an Arab proverb, that says, man is afraid of time, and time is afraid of pyramid. It means that for him, the pyramid or the monument was let's say, the source of architecture, and that's the main idea is what are we going to leave to our ancestors for the future.
Can we, with the question of what do we leave to our ancestors, conclude this discussion?
No, I just one.
Okay, we need to wrap up slowly.
Yeah,
so please, concluding thoughts.
And for this thing, he believed, you know, that is a huge responsibility, you know, towards the future. What we are building, he didn't believe that he is building for a client and things like that, or for function or whatever, but something which we leave behind us. And when you look at Egyptian and all this kind of architectures, we understand this architecture. And he said, why should we introduce new language like Corbusier when we all understand the old classical language of architecture?
Thank you so much for this. And I think these are a lot of information to digest. And I would like to thank again to all our speakers for incredible contribution, a very interesting discussion that, as Luca said, could go on and on and on many times, and probably will. But now maybe we would just like to invite you for a glass of wine for whoever is still alive and with us. And thank you again.
See you all.